This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I've been debating for weeks whether to share this story. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to get this off my chest because it still haunts me, even though it happened back in the 90s when I was just a teenager living on the reservation. Growing up, my mom always taught me two things that seemed to contradict each other. First, we should help those in need whenever possible. It's part of our culture and values. Second, we should always be cautious of strangers, especially at night. I didn't fully understand the importance of that second lesson until that December night just before Christmas. It was cold that evening, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and makes your bones ache. Mom and I were driving back from my aunt's Christmas party on the other side of the reservation. It was around 10 p.m., and the roads were empty except for our old Chevy pickup truck bumping along the uneven road. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, and beyond that beam was just pure black night. About 15 minutes from home, we passed another truck pulled over on the side of the road. Two men were struggling with something in the bed. Looked like a large tarp or canvas that kept shifting around. Mom slowed down a bit as we passed, which was normal. Folks on the res often stopped to help each other out, but then she suddenly accelerated. "Shouldn't we see if they need help?" I asked, looking back through the rear window. Mom's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Not tonight," she said firmly. I didn't think much of it at the time. When we got home, our house was freezing. Most homes on the reservation used wood stoves for heat back then, and ours had gone out while we were gone. "Get the fire going," Mom said as she started unloading stuff from the party. "I'll bring in the leftovers and that blanket your aunt made you." I nodded and went to work. Our wood stove was ancient, a cast-iron beast that sat in the corner of our living room. I crumpled newspaper, stacked kindling in a little teepee, and got a small flame going. I was adding larger logs when I heard a knock at the door. 3 firm knocks. Pause. 3 more. It was nearly 11 p.m. by then. Nobody on the res visits that late without calling first. I looked through the window beside the door and saw 2 men standing on our porch. With a shock, I recognized them as the same guys from the truck we'd passed earlier. How did they know where we lived? The reservation isn't tiny, but it's not exactly a metropolis either. They must have followed us. "Mom," I called out, "those guys from the road are here." She came in from the kitchen, frowning. "What do they want?" Before she could reach the door, I opened it. Just a crack at first, then wider. "Evening," said the taller one. "Sorry to bother you so late." He had a deep voice and wore a scarf pulled up over his mouth despite being on our heated porch. I could only see his eyes, which looked wrong somehow. Too bright, maybe. Too fixed. The shorter one stood slightly behind him, wearing a hoodie pulled low. He wouldn't make eye contact with me at all. "We're having trouble with our truck," the tall one continued. "Got a flat tire about a mile back. Saw you folks pass earlier and thought maybe you could help us change it. We've got a spare, just need an extra hand." I didn't remember seeing a flat tire when we drove past them. They'd been standing, working with something in the truck bed. Nothing about changing a tire. Still, I'd been taught to help people in need. "I can help," I said before Mom could respond. "Let me get my coat." Mom grabbed my arm as I turned. Her fingers dug into my skin. "I need to finish bringing things in from the car," she said tightly. "Don't be long. It's getting late." I nodded, not understanding the fear in her eyes. I grabbed my coat and followed the men down our driveway. Their truck was parked about 50 yards from our house, just beyond where our porch light reached. As we approached, I noticed the tarp in the back was more securely fastened now, tied down at all corners. "The flat's on this side," the tall one said, leading me to the passenger side of the truck. When I saw the tire, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just flat, it was shredded. The rubber was torn to ribbons, and the metal rim was badly bent, like they'd been driving on it for miles. "What happened to it?" I asked, kneeling to inspect the damage. "Hit something on the road," the shorter one said. It was the first time I'd heard him speak, and his voice was oddly high-pitched, almost like he was trying to make it sound that way. Drove a bit before we realized how bad it was. That was a lie. Nobody could drive on a tire this damaged without knowing it. The noise alone would have been unbearable. I helped them jack up the truck and remove what was left of the tire. The whole time I felt watched, not just by these two men, but by something else. I kept glancing at the tarp in the truck bed. Once, I swear I saw it move, just slightly, even though there was no wind. The spare tire they had was nearly bald but intact. I mounted it and tightened the lug nuts, working quickly, wanting nothing more than to get back to our house. When I finished, the tall man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. "Here," he said, holding it out to me, "for your trouble." It was $100 bill. That was a lot of money, especially on the reservation in the 90s. "No, that's okay," I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Just helping out." "Take it," he insisted, pushing it toward me. His hand was oddly pale against the green of the bill, almost grayish. "We insist." Something about the way he said it, the intensity, made me take the money, though everything inside me was screaming not to touch it. "Thanks for your help," he said. "We'll be on our way now." I nodded and backed away, watching as they got into the truck. Neither of them said another word to me. The engine started with a roar, and they pulled away, heading west on the main road. I walked back to our house with the $100 bill burning in my pocket. Mom was waiting at the door. "Are they gone?" she asked, looking past me into the darkness. "Yeah, just needed help changing a flat." She nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. "Wash your hands," she said, "with soap. Right now." I did as I was told, scrubbing my hands under hot water until my skin was red and raw. I didn't tell her about the money. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I was a teenager and thought about what I could buy with it, or maybe because something deep down told me to keep it a secret. That night, I couldn't sleep. My room felt too hot, then too cold. I tossed and turned, tangling myself in the sheets. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of running on all fours across the desert, chasing something I couldn't quite see. I woke up the next morning burning with fever. My joints ached like they were filled with broken glass, and my head pounded with each heartbeat. Mom took one look at me and called my grandmother. My grandmother was a medicine woman, what some people would call a crystal gazer. She knew the old ways and could often see things others couldn't. When she arrived, her weathered face grew serious as she looked at me. "What happened last night?" she asked, laying a cool hand on my forehead. Mom explained about the men and their truck, how they'd followed us home and asked for help. Grandmother listened silently, her eyes never leaving my face. "Did they give you anything?" she asked me directly. "Did you touch them or take anything from them?" I hesitated, then reached under my pillow and pulled out the $100 bill. It was damp with my sweat, the edges curling. Grandmother didn't touch it. She stared at it, then closed her eyes and began to murmur in our language. After a long moment, She opened her eyes and looked at me with such sadness and fear that my heart raced. "Those weren't men," she said quietly. "They were skinwalkers." Mom gasped and covered her mouth. "What?" I asked, though I'd heard the stories all my life. Skinwalkers, evil witches with the power to transform into animals or take on aspects of them, beings that practice the darkest magic. "There were more," Grandmother continued. "4 more under the tarp. They didn't want you to see them. They were traveling to Sanders to do harm to someone there." My skin crawled as I remembered the shifting tarp, the feeling of being watched by more than just the 2 men. "This," she pointed to the bill without touching it, "carries their illness, their negative energy. It's why you're sick now. They marked you." She performed a ceremony right there in my bedroom, burning herbs and speaking ancient words while Mom stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. The smoke from the herbs stung my eyes and made me cough, but gradually the fog in my head began to clear. When Grandmother finished, she wrapped the $100 bill in a special cloth and took it away to dispose of properly. Before she left, she sat on the edge of my bed and took my hands. "You must learn from this," she said. "There are 3 ways witchcraft can be transmitted: through touch, through a stare, and through words. Never help strangers on the reservation at night. Never accept gifts from those you don't know. And never follow someone into the darkness." It took 3 days for my fever to break completely. During that time, I had vivid nightmares of men with animal eyes watching me through my window, of running on 4 legs instead of 2, of a hunger so deep it felt like it would consume me from the inside out. When I was finally well enough to leave the house, Mom drove me to the spot where I'd helped change the tire. There was nothing there, no sign that a vehicle had pulled over, no marks in the dirt where I'd knelt to work, nothing. But etched into a nearby rock was a symbol I'd never seen before. Grandmother recognized it when we described it. It was a sigil meant to trap a soul, to mark someone for later. For me. I'm almost 40 now, living off the reservation, but I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I can hear 3 knocks at my door. Pause. 3 more. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd refused to help them, or if I hadn't taken that money. Would they have left me alone, or would they have taken something more valuable than my temporary peace of mind? I don't drive at night anymore if I can help it, and I never, ever stop to help stranded motorists. Some would call that callous or selfish, but they didn't see what I saw in those men's eyes. They weren't human eyes. They were something ancient and hungry, something that saw me not as a person, but as prey. To this day, I can't explain why they chose our house that night, or why they let me live. Grandmother said they probably wanted to mark more people, to spread their influence further. Or maybe they were just playing with me, the way a cat plays with a mouse before the kill. All I know is that I felt their presence for years afterward. Sometimes I still do, especially around Christmas, when the nights are long and the darkness seems to press against my windows like a living thing. I feel them watching, waiting. For what? I don't know, and I hope I never find out. I still can't sleep properly. It's been almost a year since last Christmas, and my wife thinks I should talk about it, get it out there. Maybe someone will have answers. I don't know if sharing this will help, but I need to try something because the nightmares won't stop. Last year, I was doing my usual last-minute Christmas shopping on Boxing Day for the following year. Yeah, I'm one of those bargain hunters. My girls were 6 and 8 at the time, still firmly in the Santa-believing phase, and I wanted to keep the magic alive as long as possible. While picking through the 75% off decorations at Target, I found this ornament that had a small built-in camera. The box said it could record up to 8 hours of footage and was marketed as a way to capture Christmas morning memories. I thought it was perfect. I could finally get footage of myself as Santa for the girls to watch when they were older. When I got home, I stashed it away with the other Christmas stuff in our basement storage. Fast forward to last December, and I was pretty excited to try it out. My wife Amy thought it was a cute idea too. The ornament itself was nothing special, just a regular red bauble with a tiny pinhole camera on one side. It came with a small remote to start and stop recording, and you could download the footage to your laptop through a micro USB port hidden under a little flap. On December 23rd, I tested it out to make sure everything worked. The battery seemed to hold a charge fine, and the video quality was decent enough considering the size of the camera. I uploaded a quick test video to my laptop, just me waving at it from across the living room. It captured sound too, which was an unexpected bonus. Christmas Eve came and everything was normal. We had our traditional dinner, watched Home Alone with the girls, and set out cookies and milk for Santa before tucking them into bed around 9 p.m. They were so excited they could barely sleep, but eventually the house got quiet. Around 11:30, Amy went to bed, and I started getting ready for my Santa performance. I hung the ornament on the tree in a spot where it had a clear view of the fireplace and the presents. I pressed the remote to start recording, saw the tiny red light blink 3 times to confirm it was working, and then put the remote on the mantel. Then I went upstairs to get into my costume. I'm not going to lie, I get into the whole Santa thing. I've got a decent costume, not one of those cheap polyester ones, but a proper velvet suit with a good beard. I even stuffed pillows under it to get the right shape. Amy always laughs at how seriously I take it, but hey, it's for the kids, right? Around midnight, I came downstairs in full Santa mode. I ate some of the cookies, drank the milk, and arranged the presents under the tree. I even wrote a quick note from Santa thanking the girls for the cookies. Nothing fancy, just the usual stuff. The whole performance probably took about 15 minutes, and then I went back upstairs, took off the costume, and went to bed. Christmas morning came way too early. Emma, my youngest, was jumping on our bed at 6 a.m., begging to go downstairs. Lily, my oldest, was right behind her. Amy and I dragged ourselves out of bed, and I grabbed my phone to take pictures of their reactions. The girls went nuts when they saw all the presents under the tree. After a few minutes of excitement, I remembered the ornament. Hey girls, want to see something cool? Santa was recorded on our special ornament last night. They were beyond excited. I carefully took the ornament off the tree, removed the battery, one of those flat circular ones, and connected it to my laptop with the USB cable. The file loaded up, and I sat with the girls on the couch while Amy made coffee in the kitchen. The video started normally, just our empty living room with the lights from the tree making everything look festive. After about a minute, you could see me coming down the stairs in my Santa outfit. The girls were squealing and pointing, completely convinced it was the real Santa. I played along, acting surprised, saying things like, "Wow, he really came to our house." They watched me eat cookies and arrange presents for about 5 minutes, and then they got distracted by the actual presents and ran off to start opening them. I left the video playing on my laptop on the coffee table as we all got caught up in the Christmas morning chaos, wrapping paper flying everywhere, the girls showing off their new toys, Amy taking pictures. About 20 minutes into present opening, I noticed a gift I didn't recognize. It was wrapped in metallic blue paper with a silver ribbon, not matching any of the wrapping paper we had used. It had a small tag that just said, "For Dad," in handwriting I didn't recognize. I figured Amy must have gotten me something extra and used different paper to distinguish it. "Hey, what's this one?" I asked, holding it up. Amy looked confused. "I didn't wrap anything in blue paper." I was about to say something else when Emma piped up. "That must be from Mr. L." I turned to her. "Mr. L? Who's that?" She pointed at my laptop screen. "The elf man. Look." That's when I noticed the video was still playing. I glanced at the screen and my blood turned to ice. There was someone else in our living room. In the footage, after I had gone back upstairs, the room was empty for maybe 10 minutes. Then a tall figure stepped into frame from the direction of our kitchen. He was wearing what looked like an elf costume, green tights, a pointed hat, and a red tunic. But this wasn't some cheerful Christmas elf. The costume looked old and dirty, and the way the person moved was wrong, stiff, mechanical almost. The figure just stood there, completely motionless, staring directly at the camera, for over an hour, according to the timestamp. Just standing, watching, not moving a muscle. My hands were shaking as I hit the fast-forward button. The girls had gone back to their presents, oblivious to what I was seeing. Amy was in the kitchen getting breakfast ready. It was just me watching this thing in our home while we slept upstairs. In fast forward, I could see the figure finally move. It walked, no, it glided, toward our kitchen table, where we had left a plate of gingerbread men. It picked one up, brought it to its face, and bit the head off in one clean motion. Then it turned back toward the camera. I slowed the video back to normal speed as the figure approached the tree. Its breathing became audible, a wheezing, wet sound that made my skin crawl. It got closer and closer to the camera until its face filled the screen. The mask, God, I hope it was a mask, was pale with exaggerated features like a caricature of an elf. But the eyes behind it were very real, dark, focused. A hand reached up toward the camera, and then the video cut to static. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the blue package. Emma was tugging at my sleeve, asking if I was okay. I managed to nod and slowly unwrap the package, trying to keep my breathing steady. Inside was the battery from the ornament, the same one I had just removed to connect it to my laptop. I checked the ornament again. Sure enough, the battery compartment was empty. I felt sick. This person, this Mr. L, as Emma had called him, had been in our house, had watched us sleep, had touched our things, had taken the battery from the camera after turning it off. I made some excuse to the girls about needing to check something outside and ran to inspect all our doors and windows. Everything was locked, no signs of forced entry. I checked the security system, no alerts, no evidence of doors or windows opening during the night. How did they get in? How did they know about the camera? Why did they leave the battery as a gift? And worst of all, what else did they do after turning off that camera? We called the police immediately. They took the footage and searched the house but found nothing. No fingerprints, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there except for that video and the battery. They increased patrols in our neighborhood for a few weeks, but nothing ever came of it. We moved 3 months later. I couldn't stay in that house knowing someone had been inside watching us. The girls don't know the real reason why. Amy told them it was for my job, and they believed her. I threw away all my Christmas decorations, including the Santa suit. I keep thinking about what Emma said. Mr. L. She said it so casually, like she knew who it was. When I asked her later who Mr. L was, she just shrugged and said, "The elf man who watches us sleep sometimes." Amy and I took her to a child psychologist. but they said it was probably just an imaginary friend or something she'd picked up from a Christmas story. But I know what I saw on that video, and I know that battery was real. I won't be putting up a Christmas tree this year. I check our locks 3 times every night now, and sometimes when the house is quiet, I swear I can hear that wheezing, wet breathing just outside our bedroom door. What terrifies me most isn't just that someone was in our home that night. It's that they wanted us to know they were there. They wanted me to see them, to know they had been watching, and I can't shake the feeling they're still watching us now. I've been staring at this blank page for like 20 minutes, trying to figure out how to start. I guess there's no perfect way to describe what happened last Christmas, so I'll just jump in. It's been almost a year, and I still get this hollow feeling in my chest when I think about it. So, my grandparents arrived 3 days before Christmas. I remember being happy to see them pull into our driveway in their old Buick. Grandpa Joe still drives like he's got all the time in the world, which drives my dad crazy, but I've always found it kind of comforting. Grandma Helen brought her famous apple pie, the one with the cinnamon crumble topping that makes the whole house smell amazing. We had dinner together that night, nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs that Mom made. But it felt good having everyone around the table. 2 days before Christmas, my sister Amber dragged me to the mall to shop for our little brother Ethan. He's 8 and still obsessed with dinosaurs and those collectible action figures everyone's kids want now. The mall was a nightmare. People everywhere. Christmas music blasting so loud you could barely think. While we were in the toy store, Amber kept nudging me and pointing out different girls, asking if I thought they were cute. "Come on, Jake, you need to find yourself a girlfriend before Christmas," she kept saying. "It's depressing watching you alone every year." I tried to laugh it off, but it stung a little. I'd broken up with my girlfriend Melissa back in September, and honestly wasn't ready to date again. But Amber never knew when to stop. That's just how she is. "Maybe Santa will bring you one," she joked while we stood in the checkout line. I rolled my eyes and paid for Ethan's T-Rex figure, which cost way more than I expected. Christmas Eve was actually pretty great. We all played Mario Kart in the living room, and I destroyed everyone, even Dad, who claims he lets us win. He definitely doesn't. Later that night, we drove around looking at Christmas lights. There's this one house in our neighborhood that goes all out. Synchronized lights, inflatable snowmen, the works. Ethan had his face pressed against the window the whole time, eyes wide like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. When we got home, Mom made hot chocolate with those little marshmallows that Ethan loves. We watched A Christmas Story for probably the 1,000th time, and Grandpa fell asleep in his chair halfway through. It felt normal. Good. I went to bed feeling excited for the next day. Christmas morning, I woke up to Ethan jumping on my bed at like 6 a.m. Jake, Santa came. Get up." He was basically vibrating with excitement. I rubbed my eyes and checked my phone. 6:12 a.m. Great. But I couldn't be mad at him. His enthusiasm was contagious. I threw on some sweatpants and an old t-shirt and followed him downstairs where everyone was already gathering in the living room. Dad was setting up his camera on the tripod like he does every year. Mom was bringing in coffee for the adults, and my grandparents were sitting on the couch looking tired but happy. The tree looked amazing, all lit up with presents stacked underneath. Ethan was bouncing around, pointing at different packages, trying to guess what was inside each one. Mom made us wait until everyone had their coffee before we could start opening gifts. The anticipation was killing Ethan, but finally Dad said, "Okay, let's do this." Mom played Santa like always, picking up gifts and reading the tags. "This one's for Ethan from Grandma and Grandpa," she announced. handing him a big box that turned out to be some elaborate Lego set. His face lit up like he'd just been handed the moon. One by one, gifts were distributed. Amber got some expensive headphones she'd been hinting about for months, clothes, and gift cards. Ethan tore through dinosaur toys, a new Nintendo game, clothes he didn't care about, and candy. Mom and Dad exchanged their usual practical gifts. A new coat for Dad, a spa gift card for Mom. My grandparents got their gifts, photo books, sweaters, the pocket knife Dad bought for Grandpa. I sat cross-legged on the floor, waiting for my name to be called. The pile of presents under the tree got smaller and smaller. I kept thinking my gift must be hidden somewhere special, or maybe they were saving mine for last. But as the last present was handed to my dad, a set of grilling tools from my grandparents, I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that there was nothing left under the tree. Nothing for me, not a single gift. There was this weird moment where everyone seemed to realize it at the same time. The room got quiet. Mom looked at Dad with this confused expression, her eyebrows pulled together. "Wait," she said, her voice sounding strange. "Where are Jake's presents?" Dad blinked, looking just as confused. "I thought you were shopping for him this year." Mom's face drained of color. "No, we talked about this. You said you'd get his gifts because I was handling Ethan's." "I never said that," Dad insisted, his voice getting that defensive edge it does when he thinks he's being blamed for something. "You always shop for the kids." "Not this year. We specifically discussed it." While they argued, I sat there feeling like I was shrinking, like I was physically getting smaller on the living room floor. My face felt hot, and there was this pressure behind my eyes that I was desperately fighting against. I wasn't going to cry, not in front of everyone. Then Ethan, who didn't fully understand what was happening, looked at me with his chocolate milk mustache and said, "Santa forgot about you, Jake," and he laughed. He didn't mean to be cruel. He's just a kid. But that laugh cut through me like glass. Grandma Helen put her hand over her mouth. "Oh dear, we thought you two were handling Jake's gifts. That's why we didn't." "We brought him a card," Grandpa added quietly, looking embarrassed. "It's in our suitcase. We thought that with him being 19 now." Amber wasn't saying anything, just staring at her new headphones like they were suddenly made of poison. "I can't believe this," Mom said, her voice cracking. "How did this happen? How did we forget?" The argument escalated. Mom blamed Dad for the miscommunication. Dad said Mom should have double-checked. Grandma tried to smooth things over by suggesting they could go shopping later. Everyone was talking about me like I wasn't even there. I remember looking around at all the torn wrapping paper, the gifts everyone else had received, and feeling this incredible emptiness open up inside me. It wasn't even about the presents. I'm not materialistic. It was the fact that I had been completely forgotten by my entire family on Christmas. "It's fine," I said, standing up. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Really? It's not a big deal?" But it was a big deal, and everyone knew it. "We'll go shopping this afternoon," Mom said quickly. "The mall will be open. We'll get whatever you want, Jake." I forced a smile that felt like it might break my face. "Seriously, don't worry about it. I'm going to go read for a bit." I escaped to my room before anyone could stop me. I grabbed my copy of The Fellowship of the Ring, a book I'd already read 3 times, and tried to lose myself in Middle-earth. But the words kept blurring, and I found myself reading the same paragraph over and over. I could hear the muffled sounds of my parents still arguing downstairs. About an hour later, there was a soft knock on my door. Mom came in, looking like she'd been crying. She sat on the edge of my bed, Jake, I am so sorry. I don't even know what to say. I kept my eyes on my book. It's really okay, Mom. It's not okay, she said, her voice breaking. Your father and I completely dropped the ball. We messed up terribly. She explained how they'd been so busy with work and preparing for the grandparents' visit that they'd miscommunicated about who was shopping for whom. Dad thought Mom was handling my gifts. Mom thought Dad was taking care of it. Somehow, in all the holiday chaos, I'd slipped through the cracks. We'll go to the mall tomorrow when it opens, she promised. You can pick out whatever you want. Money's not an issue. But that just made it worse. It wasn't about the stuff. It was about being an afterthought, about being so unimportant that my entire family could forget me on Christmas morning. I don't want anything, I told her, seriously. She tried to hug me, but I turned away, pretending to be really invested in my book. Eventually, she left. Lunch was awkward. Everyone was trying too hard to act normal. Ethan, who didn't fully understand what had happened, kept showing me his new toys. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, but inside, I felt hollow. That night, Dad came to my room. He's not good with emotional stuff, so he stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets. Your mom and I feel terrible, he said. We really messed up. I know, Dad, it's fine. It's not fine, he insisted. You're our son, and he trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Anyway, we're going to make it up to you. But how do you make up for something like that? How do you fix the realization that you're so easy to forget? The next morning, my grandparents left earlier than planned. There was this tension in the air that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Grandma hugged me extra tight and slipped me a card with $100 in it, whispering, "I'm so sorry, honey." It just made me feel worse. After they left, Mom and Dad got ready for work. I was surprised they weren't taking the day off to take me shopping like they'd promised, but apparently there were end-of-year deadlines they couldn't miss. They left without saying goodbye. I heard the cars start and pull out of the driveway from my bedroom. Amber went out with her friends. Ethan had a play date at a neighbor's house. And just like that, I was alone in the house the day after Christmas. I sat on the couch and stared at the Christmas tree with all its twinkling lights. There were still a few wrapped presents under it, gifts for relatives who hadn't come over yet. But nothing with my name on it. My phone kept buzzing with texts from friends asking if I wanted to hang out, see what everyone got for Christmas. I couldn't bring myself to respond. What was I supposed to say? My family collectively forgot I exist? The worst part, the absolute worst part, was realizing this wasn't some kind of elaborate prank or surprise. No one was going to jump out and say, "Just kidding, here are your real presents." They had genuinely, completely forgotten about me. How does that even happen? I kept replaying the last few weeks in my head, trying to figure out where I'd become invisible. Was I not around enough? Did I not drop enough hints about things I wanted? But I'd been there the whole time, helping decorate the tree, wrapping presents for everyone else, baking those stupid Christmas cookies Mom insists on making every year. At some point, I just broke down and cried, alone in the living room, surrounded by everyone else's Christmas joy. I'm not proud of it, but I couldn't hold it in anymore. When everyone came home that evening, I pretended everything was fine. I smiled, I joked, I helped clean up dinner. But something had changed inside me. Some fundamental trust was broken. Mom kept promising we'd go shopping tomorrow for sure, but somehow tomorrow never came. There was always some reason. Stores were too crowded, Dad had to work late, Ethan wasn't feeling well. Eventually, I told them to stop mentioning it, to just let it go. They seemed relieved, which hurt even more. It's been almost a year now, and we've never really talked about it again. It's this weird stain on our family history that everyone pretends isn't there. Sometimes I catch Mom looking at me with this sad, guilty expression, especially now that we're approaching another Christmas. I know they didn't mean to hurt me. I know it wasn't malicious. But that almost makes it worse, you know? The fact that forgetting me completely was so easy for them, that I'm so forgettable. I still don't know how to process what happened that day. All I know is that when I look at Christmas decorations now, I get this hollow feeling in my chest that I can't shake. And I'm dreading December 25th more than I can say. I've been holding this in for almost 15 years now, and I need to tell someone. I grew up in a small town in Michoacan, not too far from Morelia. We weren't rich, not even close. After my dad left for the U.S. when I was 9, my mom had to figure out how to feed me and my 2 younger siblings on her own. Mom was always resourceful. She saved enough to buy 12 chickens and converted our small backyard into a chicken coop using wire fencing and scrap wood. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. Those chickens changed everything for us. Within a week, we had fresh eggs every morning, way more than we could eat ourselves. Mom started selling the extras to neighbors for a few pesos. It wasn't much, but that little bit of extra income meant we could buy school supplies or medicine when we needed it. Sometimes she'd trade eggs for other things we needed, fruit from Doña Marta's trees, or help fixing our leaky roof from Señor Jimenez. By the 6-month mark, our little egg business was actually working. The chickens were healthy, laying consistently, and we had regular customers who'd stop by every few days. Mom even expanded to 18 chickens. I remember feeling so proud watching her hand over those small cartons of eggs, knowing we weren't just surviving anymore. Then one afternoon in April, my mom's friend Teresa came to visit from a village about an hour away. They hadn't seen each other in years, and they spent hours in our kitchen, drinking coffee and catching up. When Teresa was leaving, Mom insisted on giving her a dozen eggs to take home. Para los niños, she said, for the children. Teresa tried to pay, but Mom wouldn't hear of it. That's just how she was. Generous, even when we didn't have much. About 3 weeks later, something weird started happening. People we didn't know began showing up at our door asking for eggs. At first, it was just 1 or 2 strangers a week, people from villages we'd never heard of. They'd ask for just 1 or 2 eggs, which seemed strange. Why travel so far for so little? But Mom never questioned it. She'd wrap their eggs carefully in newspaper and send them on their way. Then the number of strangers increased. 5, 10, sometimes 15 people a day would come by, always asking for just 1 or 2 eggs, always from places far from our town. Some looked sick, coughing or walking with canes. Others seemed perfectly healthy but desperate. They'd offer way more money than the eggs were worth, but Mom kept charging her normal price, saying it wouldn't be right to take advantage. I remember asking her why she thought all these people were suddenly coming for our eggs. She just shrugged and said, "Quién sabe? Maybe the chickens from their towns aren't laying well this season." But I knew that couldn't be it. Something else was happening. One morning, about 2 months after Teresa's visit, she showed up at our door again. I could tell by the look on her face that something serious was going on. Mom sent us kids outside to feed the chickens while they talked, but I snuck back in and listened from the hallway. "Isabel, I need to tell you something," Teresa said, her voice low. "Remember those eggs you gave me? I took one to Don Luis. I knew who Don Luis was. Everyone in the region did. He was a curandero, a traditional healer known for his cleansings and remedies. Some people swore he could cure anything from bad luck to serious illnesses. Others said he was just an old man taking advantage of desperate people. My mom never talked badly about curanderos, but she'd never taken us to one either. Teresa continued, "My son had been having those terrible nightmares I told you about, the ones where he would wake up screaming, saying something was sitting on his chest. Don Luis performed a limpia on him using one of your eggs. He passed it all over my son's body while saying prayers, then cracked it into a glass of water." Mom interrupted, "Teresa, those are old superstitions. Isabel, listen to me. The egg was black inside. Don Luis said he'd never seen one absorb so much negative energy before. That night, for the first time in months, my son slept peacefully. No nightmares, nothing." Teresa explained that Don Luis had asked where the egg came from, and when she told him about our chickens, he'd seemed very interested. Apparently, he'd mentioned it to a few patients, and word had spread. "Your eggs are special, Isabel," Teresa said. "Don Luis says they have properties that make them perfect for cleansing ceremonies. People are talking about it all over the region." My mom laughed nervously. "They're just eggs, Teresa, from normal chickens." "Maybe, but they're helping people. That's why everyone's coming. They take the eggs to Don Luis for their limpias." I remember Mom looking troubled by this news. She wasn't superstitious, but she also respected the old traditions. That night at dinner, she told us about the conversation with Teresa. "It's nonsense," she said firmly. "But if people think our eggs are helping them, then I'm glad. We'll keep selling them as always." For the next few weeks, business boomed. We had to turn people away because we couldn't keep up with demand. Mom even bought 5 more chickens, bringing our total to 23. We were actually saving money for the first time I could remember. Then everything fell apart. One morning in early June, I went out to collect eggs and found only 3 in the nests, when we usually had at least 15. I figured it was just a bad day. But the next morning, there were only 2 eggs. By the end of the week, the chickens had stopped laying completely. Worse, they started looking sick. Their feathers lost their shine, and they seemed lethargic. Within days, 2 of the chickens died, then 3 more. Mom called a veterinarian from the nearby town, who examined the remaining chickens, but couldn't find any disease or explanation. "Sometimes this happens," he shrugged. "Maybe something got into their feed." We changed their food, gave them extra water, cleaned their coop thoroughly. Nothing helped. By the end of the month, we had lost 15 chickens. The 8 that remained were barely alive, huddled in corners of the coop, refusing to eat. Mom tried to hide it, but I could see the worry on her face. Without the egg money, we were back to struggling. She took on extra cleaning jobs, but it wasn't enough. One night, I heard her crying in her bedroom. Desperate, Mom decided to visit Don Luis herself. We took our last 2 eggs and headed to his village, about 2 hours away by bus. I remember the journey clearly, Mom clutching her small purse with the eggs wrapped carefully inside, her face tight with worry. My younger siblings stayed with a neighbor. Don Luis lived in a small house painted bright blue at the edge of town. An old, weathered sign by the door read "Curandero" in faded letters. The waiting area was just his front porch, where 3 other people sat on wooden chairs. We waited for almost 2 hours before it was our turn. Inside, his consultation room was simple, just a wooden table, a few chairs, and shelves lined with jars of herbs, candles, and religious items. Don Luis himself was older than I expected, maybe in his 70s, with deep wrinkles and hands spotted with age, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Mom explained our situation, her voice catching sometimes. Don Luis listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he asked to see the eggs. Mom unwrapped them carefully and placed them on the table. Don Luis examined them without touching, then picked one up and held it to the light. "These are special eggs," he confirmed. "The hens that lay them must be protected." He asked Mom's permission to use one egg for a cleansing. When she nodded, he lit several candles and began to pray softly. I couldn't understand everything he said. It was a mixture of Spanish and what might have been Purépecha, the indigenous language of our region. He passed the egg over a candle flame, then cracked it into a clear glass bowl filled with water. I'll never forget what happened next. The egg didn't look normal. The yolk was dark, almost black in places, and strange patterns spread through the white like ink in water. Don Luis stared at it for a long time, his expression grim. Finally, he looked up at my mother. "Someone has done this to you," he said quietly. "A brujo has cursed your chickens." I felt a chill run through me at his words. Mom looked skeptical but scared. "Why would anyone curse us?" she asked. "We're nobody. We have nothing." "Sometimes it's not about what you have, but what you're doing," Don Luis replied. "Your eggs were helping people. Perhaps this brujo lost business because people were coming to me with your eggs instead of going to him." Don Luis instructed us to take the remaining egg home and protect our surviving chickens. "Keep them inside your house tonight," he said firmly. "Not in the coop, inside your actual home. And once you're all inside, don't leave until morning, no matter what you hear outside." Mom looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Don Luis's expression stopped her. He refused payment, saying only, "Be careful, put salt across your doorways." The ride home was silent. I could tell Mom was torn between dismissing Don Luis's warnings as superstition and being genuinely afraid. When we got home, she surprised me by bringing the remaining chickens into our kitchen, putting them in large wooden boxes lined with straw. "Just for tonight," she told my siblings when they complained about the smell. "Tomorrow they go back outside." She also poured lines of salt across our doorways and windowsills, though she tried to do it casually, as if it wasn't related to Don Luis's warning. "We have too many ants anyway," she said with forced lightness. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a strange sound outside, something between a whistle and a hiss. I crept to my window and peered through the curtains. There, in our yard near the empty chicken coop, was the largest owl I had ever seen. It was almost completely white, with a face that seemed too human somehow. In Michoacán, we call these birds lechuzas, and old stories say they're connected to witchcraft, that brujos can transform into these birds to do their dark work. The lechuza turned its head and seemed to look directly at me. Its eyes reflected the moonlight in a way that made them glow red. I dropped the curtain and ran to my mom's room, shaking her awake. "There's a lechuza outside," I whispered urgently. Mom got up and looked out her window. When she saw the bird, her face went pale. She pushed me back from the window. "Don't look at it," she said. "Go check on the chickens." The chickens were huddled together in their boxes, making small, distressed sounds. They seemed terrified. I stayed with them in the kitchen, too scared to go back to my room. Mom sat in a chair by the door all night, a kitchen knife in her hand. None of us slept. Just before dawn, we heard a terrible screeching sound from outside, like an animal in pain, but with an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. Then silence. When the sun finally rose, Mom opened the front door cautiously. There, surrounding our entire house, was a line of white powder that hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't salt. It looked more like ash or crushed chalk. It formed a perfect circle around our property. Mom wouldn't let us cross it or touch it. She swept it away with a broom, her hands shaking slightly. The strangest part? Our remaining chickens recovered almost immediately. By that afternoon, they were eating normally again. 3 days later, they started laying eggs. Within 2 weeks, they were producing more eggs than ever before. Mom never talked about that night. When I tried to bring it up, she would change the subject or say it was just a coincidence. She bought new chickens to replace the ones we lost, and our egg business recovered. The strangers still came for eggs, but less frequently, and Mom never turned them away. About a month later, we heard that a man had died in Don Luis's village. The funeral was closed, no public viewing, which was unusual in our community. People whispered that the dead man had been a brujo known for black magic. I overheard Mom asking Teresa if it was true, but Teresa just crossed herself and said it was better not to speak of such things. Years passed. I went to university in Morelia, the first in my family to get higher education, paid for in part by that egg money. Mom passed away last year, nothing supernatural, just cancer that spread too quickly for treatments to help. After the funeral, my siblings and I were sorting through her things when I found a small pouch hidden in her dresser. Inside was a dried, shriveled object that I eventually realized was an egg, preserved somehow to prevent it from rotting. Wrapped around it was a piece of paper with Don Luis's name and a date, the night of the lechuza. I still don't know exactly what happened all those years ago. Was there really a curse? Was the lechuza actually a transformed brujo? One thing has always bothered me. Don Luis never came to our house that night, at least not in human form, so who made that protective circle of white powder? Sometimes I wonder if the lechuza I saw wasn't the brujo at all, but Don Luis himself, using his own abilities to protect us. In the old stories, after all, not all shapeshifters are evil. I've never told this story to anyone outside my family. My university friends would think I'm superstitious or crazy. But in Michoacán, in the small towns where curanderos still practice and people still believe in both healing and harmful magic, no one would doubt that our eggs really were special, or that a brujo might curse us for sharing their power. All I know for certain is that something happened that night that I can't explain. And sometimes, when I visit my hometown and hear an owl call in the darkness, I still feel a chill run down my spine, and I make sure all my doors and windows are securely closed before I go to sleep. I've debated whether to share this for months. It happened last November, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about it. I'm a hunter, have been my whole life. My dad taught me when I was 12, and I've spent 20-plus years tracking deer across the same patch of forest my family's owned for generations. I know every tree, every trail, every seasonal change on those 80 acres. At least I thought I did. That morning started like any other hunting day. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., had my coffee and some eggs, packed my gear, and drove out to the property in my pickup. The forecast said clear skies, around 40 degrees, perfect hunting weather. I parked at the old logging road entrance, grabbed my .30-06, and started the half-mile hike to my favorite stand. Something felt off right away. Can't really explain it, but the woods felt wrong. Too quiet. Usually there's birds, squirrels rustling around, all that normal forest noise. But that day, nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees, making this weird whispering sound. I've been in those woods 1,000 times and never felt so watched. I kept telling myself I was being stupid. This is my land, posted all around the perimeter. No one else should be here. But that feeling of eyes on me wouldn't go away. I even stopped a couple times, did a full 360, scanning the trees. Nothing. But man, the silence was getting to me. About 20 minutes in, I reached this small clearing I know well. It's where I've taken a few nice bucks over the years. And that's when I saw it. A big 8-pointer, but not the way you want to find one. It was just destroyed. Throat completely torn out, stomach ripped open, organs scattered. But the weirdest part? No feeding. Whatever killed it didn't eat it, just tore it apart. I've seen plenty of deer carcasses. Coyotes will take down a deer, sure, but they feed on it. This was different. This was violence for the sake of violence. And it was fresh, maybe a few hours old. That's when the fear really hit me. This wasn't normal predator behavior. Not a bear, not coyotes. Maybe a mountain lion, but we haven't had confirmed sightings in my county for decades. And the sheer brutality of it. I started backing away, hand tight on my rifle. Then I heard it. A deep, guttural scream that froze me in place. Not an animal sound I'd ever heard before. Somewhere between a bear's roar and a human scream, but deeper, more primal. I spun around, rifle raised, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I'm not ashamed to say I panicked. I turned and started moving fast back toward my truck. Not running. Hunters know better than to run in the woods. But moving with purpose, let's say. I kept hearing things behind me, twigs snapping, heavy footfalls. Something big was following me. About halfway back to my truck, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. Just a silhouette, but it was massive, way taller than a person, maybe 7 feet at least. And the way it moved wasn't right. Kind of hunched over but fast, keeping pace with me through the underbrush. I picked up my pace, practically jogging now. My truck was just ahead through the trees, and I've never been so happy to see that beat-up Chevy in my life. But when I got there, my heart sank. The recent rain had turned the clearing into mud, and my front tires were sunk in about 4 inches. I jumped in, threw my rifle on the passenger seat, and cranked the engine. It started up fine, but when I tried to move, the wheels just spun. I shifted into 4WD, but as I was reaching for the lever, movement caught my eye. Standing outside my passenger window was, I don't even know how to describe it. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, shoulders as wide as a doorway. Its body was covered in thick, matted black hair, but not like a bear's fur, more coarse, almost like human hair, but everywhere. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with long, curved fingers that looked strong enough to tear through metal. But its face, God, its face, it was like someone had tried to make a human face, but got it all wrong. The proportions were off, the features distorted. Its jaw jutted out too far, filled with yellowed teeth that looked sharp as knives. Its nose was flat and wide, like it had been smashed in, and its eyes, deep set and dark, but intelligent. That's what terrifies me the most still. There was clear intelligence there, watching me, considering me. For maybe 5 seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it opened its mouth and let out that same blood-curdling scream I'd heard before, showing rows of those yellowed teeth. The sound was so loud it seemed to shake my truck. I slammed the shift into 4WD low and floored it. The tires spun, then caught, and I felt the truck lurch forward. I didn't look back, just kept my foot heavy on the gas, bouncing down that logging road like my life depended on it, because I'm pretty sure it did. About a half-mile down the road, I hit the brakes hard. A massive tree was blocking the entire road, a huge oak that had been completely uprooted. I know that road. I'd driven in on it just an hour earlier. That tree hadn't been there. I sat there for a minute, engine running, trying to think. No way my truck could go around. Too many trees on both sides. I couldn't go back. I had to get help. I grabbed my phone and was relieved to see I had 1 bar of service. I called my buddy Kenny, who lives about 15 minutes away. "Kenny, I need help. There's a tree down on my logging road and I'm stuck." "What happened? Storm damage?" he asked. "No. I don't know, man. Something's out here, something big. I need you to bring your chainsaw and come help me clear this road. And bring your gun." "Your gun ain't enough?" He laughed, but stopped when I didn't join in. "Just hurry, please." The wait for Kenny was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept my engine running and doors locked, constantly checking my mirrors and scanning the trees. Nothing moved, but that feeling of being watched never left. When Kenny's truck finally appeared behind me, I got out, rifle in hand. He pulled up and stepped out, shotgun in one hand, chainsaw in the other, looking concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Worse," I replied. "Help me with this tree." We examined the fallen oak. Kenny pointed out what I'd already noticed. It hadn't fallen naturally. It had been pulled out by the roots. "Storm didn't do this," Kenny said, crouching down. "And look at these." Around the base of the tree were footprints, huge human-like footprints, at least 18 inches long, pressed deep into the mud. "What the hell made these?" Kenny whispered. I just shook my head. "We need to clear this and get out, now." Kenny fired up his chainsaw and started cutting while I kept watch, my rifle ready. It took about 15 minutes to cut enough of the tree away to make a path. Just as we were loading the last big branch off the road, we heard it. That same ungodly scream coming from the direction of my hunting spot. Kenny nearly dropped the log. "What the hell was that?" "That's what I've been trying to tell you. Get in your truck. Let's go." We both got back to our vehicles and drove the rest of the way out to the main road. I led the way to my house about 5 miles away, constantly checking my mirrors. Kenny followed close behind. As we passed the Patterson farm, I noticed a group of deer at the edge of their hayfield, a good-sized buck with several does. Despite everything, the hunter in me noticed. I slowed down, and Kenny pulled up alongside me. "You still thinking about hunting after what just happened?" he asked through his open window, looking at me like I was crazy. I was about to answer when Kenny's expression changed. His face went slack, and he raised his hand to point past me. "Jacob, look." I turned and felt my blood freeze. At the edge of the woods bordering the field, maybe 200 yards away, it was standing there, watching us. In the daylight, it looked even more grotesque, its proportions all wrong for any animal I knew. It was standing partially behind a tree, but its size was unmistakable. "You see that?" I whispered. Kenny nodded slowly. "What the fuck is that thing?" We sat there, engines idling, watching it watch us. Then it moved, stepping fully into the open, as if challenging us. It was even bigger than I'd thought, its massive frame hunched but still towering. It took a few steps toward the field, toward the oblivious deer. "It's heading toward Peterson's barn," Kenny said. "There's kids over there." Without thinking, I grabbed my rifle and got out of the truck. Kenny followed with his shotgun. I raised my rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The deer scattered, and the creature stopped, turning its attention fully to us. For a horrible moment, it just stared. Then it let out that scream again and started moving, not away from us, but toward us, covering ground with shocking speed. "Shoot it!" Kenny yelled, raising his shotgun. I fired, and Kenny's shotgun boomed beside me. I'm certain I hit it. I saw the impact, but it didn't even slow down. After 2 more shots, it finally veered off, disappearing back into the tree line. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely lower my rifle. Kenny looked at me, his face pale. "What the hell, Jacob? What was that?" "I don't know, but we need to call someone." An hour later, my living room was filled with people. The sheriff, a deputy, and a game warden named Collins, who I've known for years. They listened to our story with the kind of expressions you'd expect. Skepticism gradually giving way to concern as both Kenny and I described the same details independently. "Could have been a bear," the sheriff suggested. "They can stand on their hind legs, look bigger than they are." "It wasn't a damn bear," Kenny snapped. "I've hunted bear. This was something else." Collins, the game warden, was quieter than the others. "You said you shot it?" I nodded. "At least once, solid hit. Didn't even flinch." "Then there should be blood," he said simply. "Show me where." So the five of us went back out there, armed to the teeth. We found the spot easily enough, shell casings on the road where Kenny and I had fired. Collins and the deputy followed a trail into the woods that neither the sheriff nor I had noticed, broken branches and disturbed ground. About a quarter-mile in, Collins stopped and crouched down. "Blood," he said, touching a dark spot on a leaf. "Not much, though." We followed the sparse blood trail another half-mile to a creek. The tracks, those same massive human-like footprints, led right to the water's edge and disappeared. Collins stood at the creek bank for a long time, staring at the ground. "There's more tracks here," he finally said. "Different sizes." He was right. Mixed in with the huge prints were others, smaller but similar in shape. 5, maybe 6 different sets. The sheriff rubbed his face. "You're telling me there's a whole family of these things?" Nobody answered. The investigation officially lasted 2 weeks. They found the dead buck exactly as I'd described it. They cast the footprints. They interviewed people in the area about strange sightings or sounds, but eventually the official conclusion was unidentified predator, possibly bear. Most people around here didn't believe our story, called it mass hysteria, or said we'd seen a bear and panicked. But some did believe, especially after pets started disappearing in the area. A few farms lost livestock, all with the same signature, throats torn out, bodies ripped open but not fed upon. I haven't been back to my hunting property since. Can't bring myself to go there. I've thought about selling, but how could I, in good conscience, put some other family in harm's way? Sometimes at night, when the wind is high, I swear I can hear that scream, carrying across the fields from the direction of my woods. And I lie awake wondering what's out there, watching and waiting. Something that walks like a man but isn't. Something with intelligence in its eyes and blood on its hands. Something that seems to hold a grudge. I used to think I knew those woods. Now I know better. There are things in this world we don't understand. Things we aren't meant to understand. And sometimes they're watching us from just beyond the tree line. I've been putting off writing about this for almost 3 years now. Every time I try, my hands start to shake, and I get this sick feeling in my stomach. But I need to get this out somewhere, even if most people will think I'm crazy or making it up. I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to share is 100% true. I experienced it firsthand, and dozens of people from San Jose Paso Nuevo could back up my story. My name is David Hernandez. I used to live in a small town called San Jose Paso Nuevo, near the Cofre de Perote mountain in Mexico. It's one of those places where everybody knows everybody, where we still live by old traditions and beliefs that city folks would probably laugh at. But after what happened, I don't think any of us are laughing. It all started about 4 years ago. animals began disappearing from farms around town. At first it was just a chicken here or a rabbit there, nothing too unusual. Most people blamed coyotes or maybe some desperate thief. But then things got worse. Goats, pigs, even a couple of young calves vanished. What made it strange was that some disappearances happened in broad daylight, and nobody ever saw or heard anything. After a couple months, people started to get really worried. This wasn't normal animal predation. There were never any signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just animals gone without a trace. Some older folks started whispering about bad spirits and the old ones returning, but most of us tried to stay practical. Humberto Garcia was hit the hardest. His farm was on the outskirts of town, closest to the mountain and forest. In just 3 months, he'd lost 35 animals, mostly goats and chickens. He was desperate. One evening at the town cantina, Humberto announced he was offering a reward of 20,000 pesos to whoever could kill whatever was taking his livestock. What he told us next sent a chill through the room. His wife Maria had seen something 2 nights before. She'd heard the goats making noise around dusk and went to check on them. That's when she spotted what she described as a dog-like creature perched on top of their fence. A fence nearly 8 feet tall. She said the thing was watching the goats, completely still, like it was studying them. When it noticed her, it leapt off and disappeared into the darkness faster than anything she'd ever seen. She swore it moved on 2 legs, not 4. I was between jobs then and needed the money, so I volunteered to guard Humberto's property that weekend. 5 other guys joined in too. Miguel, Alejandro, Carlos, Esteban, and Raul. We figured it was safety in numbers, and honestly, we were all curious about what was happening. We set up a stakeout on a Friday night. Humberto let us use his shed about 50 yards from the goat pen. We brought coffee, food, and of course our guns, mostly hunting rifles and a couple of pistols. We arrived around 8 p.m. and took shifts watching through the shed window that had a clear view of the pen. The first few hours were uneventful. We played cards, told jokes, tried to keep our spirits up. Around midnight, things started to feel different. I can't explain it exactly, but the air felt heavier somehow. The normal night sounds, insects, distant dogs barking, all seemed to fade away until it was unnaturally quiet. Even the goats, usually noisy, went completely silent. By 1 a.m., Carlos and Esteban had mysteriously fallen asleep despite drinking coffee. We couldn't wake them no matter how hard we tried. They weren't just sleeping. It was like they were in some kind of trance. The rest of us, me, Miguel, Alejandro, and Raul, felt increasingly on edge. Then, at about 1:30 a.m., we heard it. A soft, rustling sound coming from the direction of the forest. Not like an animal moving through undergrowth, more like something deliberately trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. We grabbed our guns and moved to the window, killing the lantern so we wouldn't be seen. Probably just coyotes, whispered Miguel, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The rustling stopped. For about 5 minutes there was nothing. Then Alejandro grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. "There," he hissed, pointing toward the edge of the clearing. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then my eyes adjusted better, and I made out a shape crouching at the tree line. It was grayish, about the size of a large dog, but something about it wasn't right. It moved forward a little, still in that crouched position, and then, God help me, it stood up. The thing rose to about 1.5 meters tall on 2 legs. Even in the dim moonlight, I could make out details I'll never forget. Its eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris. just blank white orbs that somehow still seemed to be looking right at us. It had only one ear that I could see, jutting from the side of its head at an odd angle. Its jaw was slight, but you could see veins or tendons moving underneath its skin when it opened its mouth. The body was covered in thin, patchy fur, and its hands... Jesus, its hands had claws that must have been 10-15 centimeters long. We all froze. I literally couldn't move. It wasn't just fear, though I was terrified beyond anything I'd ever felt. It was like my body refused to respond to my brain. Later, the others said they felt the same paralysis. The creature just stood there, staring at the shed where we were hiding. It knew we were there. I'm certain of it. For what felt like an eternity, probably about 5 minutes in reality, it just watched us. Then, without warning, it made a sound I can only describe as a mix between a coyote's howl and a human moan, and leaped toward the goat pen. Its jump was impossible, at least 20 feet in a single bound. It cleared the fence easily and landed inside the pen. The goats went crazy, running in all directions, but they couldn't escape. With horrifying speed, the creature grabbed 2 young goats, one in each hand. Then it jumped back out of the pen with both animals. That's when we finally broke free of whatever had held us in place. Miguel raised his rifle and fired, but nothing happened. The gun just clicked. Alejandro tried his pistol. Same thing. Raúl and I tried our weapons too, but none would fire, despite being fully loaded and well maintained. It makes no sense, but all 4 guns failed simultaneously. The creature paused at the tree line, those white eyes seeming to stare right through us, then turned and ran into the forest with the goats. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I've ever seen, sort of hunched over but incredibly fast, disappearing between the trees in seconds. Something came over us then. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was that we were free from whatever had held us in place, but we decided to follow it. In retrospect, this was insanely dangerous, but we weren't thinking clearly. We grabbed flashlights and machetes, since our guns seemed useless, and headed into the forest, following the direction it had gone. The forest around Cofre de Perote is dense and dark. Our flashlights barely cut through the blackness, and we kept close together, jumping at every sound. We followed a trail of broken branches and disturbed ground for maybe half a mile. The trail led uphill toward a part of the mountain none of us were familiar with. Then we found it, a cave entrance partially hidden by brush. It wasn't a natural formation, at least not entirely. There were marks around the opening that looked like claw marks, but too deliberate, almost like symbols. Outside the entrance were bones, lots of them, scattered around like discarded trash. Mostly animal bones, but some looked different, larger. I didn't want to think about what they might be. We could hear sounds coming from inside the cave, a wet tearing noise and something like chewing. The smell was unbearable, rotting meat and something else, something chemical and wrong that burned my nostrils. That's when our courage finally gave out. None of us was willing to go into that cave. We marked the location as best we could and retreated back to town. By the time we got back to Humberto's place, it was nearly dawn. Carlos and Esteban were finally awake, but had no memory of falling asleep or what had happened. We told Humberto everything. At first he looked skeptical, but when all 6 of us confirmed the same story, and when he saw the genuine fear in our eyes, he believed us. He called Father Martinez, our town priest, and by mid-morning, a group of about 15 men, including the priest, had gathered to return to the cave. In daylight, with so many people, I felt braver. The forest didn't seem as threatening, though everyone fell silent as we approached the cave. It was exactly as we'd left it. Bones scattered around the entrance, those strange markings visible in the daylight. They looked even less natural now, circular patterns with lines radiating outward, carved deep into the rock. Father Martinez took one look at those markings and crossed himself. "Nagual," he whispered. I'd heard stories about the Nagual all my life, shapeshifters, people who could transform into animals, usually with evil intent. But those were just old legends, or so I'd thought. Father Martinez approached the cave entrance cautiously, holding a cross in front of him. He began to recite prayers in Latin, sprinkling holy water around the entrance. That's when we heard it, crying, human crying, coming from inside the cave. It sounded like a man in pain or grief. Several of us moved forward instinctively, but Father Martinez held up his hand to stop us. "It's a trick," he said firmly. "The Nagual will use any deception to lure victims." He continued his prayers, more urgently now. The crying grew louder, then suddenly changed, transforming into screams of rage. Words became audible, cursing us in Spanish, threatening to kill us all, to eat our children. The voice wasn't human anymore. It had a guttural, animal quality that made my skin crawl. Father Martinez instructed us to gather rocks and seal the entrance. We worked quickly, piling boulders and stones while he continued praying. He gave us small pouches filled with herbs and blessed items to place among the rocks. Protective charms, he called them. As the opening got smaller, the screams from inside grew more desperate, more enraged. The last thing I heard before we sealed it completely was laughter. Not human laughter, but something that mimicked it in a way that made me feel sick. For 3 days after, people reported hearing howling from the direction of the sealed cave. Not animal howls, something in between, something wrong. Nobody went near it. About a week later, a woman from a town about 30 miles away came to San Jose Paso Nuevo, asking questions. She was looking for her husband, who had disappeared almost 4 months earlier. He'd been a trader of sorts, she said, buying and selling animals in different towns. He'd started this business recently, after losing his job. He would be gone for days at a time, then return with money, but no explanation of where he'd been. The description she gave of him matched no one we knew in town, but when she showed us his photo, several people recognized him. He'd been seen occasionally in the area, asking about livestock for sale, always during the day, always leaving before sunset. That's when it all clicked into place. This man, this outsider who had started appearing around the same time the animals began disappearing, must have been the Nagual. According to the old legends, skinwalkers were human most of the time, only changing form when they needed to. We didn't tell the woman what had happened. How could we? Instead, we said we hadn't seen her husband and suggested she try other towns. I still feel guilty about that. But what could we have said? That her husband was a monster we'd trapped in a cave, that he wasn't human anymore, if he ever truly was. After she left, strange things started happening in town. People heard weird noises at night, scratching at their doors and windows. Black birds appeared on rooftops watching us. Sometimes the smell of rotting flesh would waft through town with no obvious source. Most disturbing were the reports of a man in black seen walking toward the mountain at dusk, always in the direction of the sealed cave. I stayed in San Jose Paso Nuevo for about 6 months after all this happened. I couldn't sleep. Every night I'd lie awake, convinced I'd hear that howl again or see those white eyes at my window. When I did sleep, I had nightmares about the cave, about what might be happening inside it, about whether the rocks would hold. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved to Mexico City, where I've been ever since. Sometimes I think about going back, just to see if things have returned to normal. But then I remember those eyes, that sound, and I know I never will. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. It sounds crazy even as I write it, but I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I know that if you visit San Jose Paso Nuevo and ask around, you'll hear the same story from many people, about the creature that stole their animals, about the cave on the mountain that no one goes near, about the man who became a monster. And if you're smart, you'll stay far away from that mountain after dark. Some things aren't meant to be understood, just avoided. I learned that the hard way, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Grew up hearing all kinds of stories about the woods around my family's property in the Appalachians. My Uncle Raft was especially fond of telling these ridiculous ghost stories whenever we had family gatherings. As a kid, they'd freak me out sometimes, but as I got older, I started seeing them for what they were. Just stories made up to scare kids and entertain adults after a few beers. Uncle Raft lived deeper in the mountains than the rest of us, in this old cabin that had been in our family for generations. He was kind of the oddball of the family, never married, kept to himself, and seemed to genuinely believe all those superstitions and folk tales he was always going on about. The older I got, the more I thought he was just a lonely old man who'd spent too much time by himself in those woods. Last month, my mom called to tell me Uncle Raft was sick and needed someone to check on him. I hadn't seen him in almost a year, so I figured it was time to pay him a visit anyway. Mom also mentioned he wanted to give me some property deed papers, since I was the only one in the family who expressed any interest in keeping the land in the family after he was gone. I drove out early that morning, taking the winding mountain roads that led to his place. The drive itself took nearly 2 hours from my apartment in town. Uncle Raft's cabin was another mile down a dirt road, and then there was a half-mile walking trail through the woods to actually reach it. He never did believe in making things convenient. When I got there, Uncle Raft looked worse than I expected. He'd lost weight, and his skin had this grayish tinge to it that didn't seem right. Still, he perked up when he saw me, and we spent the afternoon going through old papers and him telling me which parcels of land were which on these ancient-looking maps. The whole time he kept glancing out the windows like he was expecting someone or something. I figured it was just his usual paranoia, but as the afternoon wore on, he got more and more agitated. "You need to head back before it gets dark," he said, shuffling through the last of the papers. It was only about 4 p.m. and it was summer, so I still had plenty of daylight left. "I've got time," I told him. "The sun doesn't set until after 8 this time of year." He shook his head. "That don't matter up here. Things change once the shadows get long. You need to be out of these woods before then." I tried not to roll my eyes. Classic Uncle Raft, always with the ominous warnings about the forest. But I humored him. "All right, I'll head out soon." As I was packing up the papers in my backpack, he grabbed my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone who looked so frail. "Listen to me," he said, his voice dead serious. "There's things in these woods that ain't natural. Things that have been here longer than us and'll be here long after. If you're in these woods and you feel like something's watching you, there's 4 rules you follow." I nodded, more to humor him than anything else. 1. Don't look up into the trees. Whatever you do, don't acknowledge it if you see something moving up there. He held up one bony finger. 2. Don't acknowledge anything unusual. If you see something that don't look right, you pretend you didn't see it and keep walking. At this point, I was starting to get a little uncomfortable. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen before, real fear. 3, he continued, don't respond to strange sounds. If you hear someone calling your name or a woman screaming or anything like that, you ignore it. It ain't real, and answering only makes it worse. He held up 4 fingers now. And 4, if you hear footsteps behind you, don't run. Keep walking at the same pace, no matter how close they sound. Running only makes it chase you. I nodded again, trying to take him seriously, despite how ridiculous it all sounded. Got it. Don't look up. Don't acknowledge weird stuff. Don't answer strange sounds. Don't run from footsteps. Anything else? Just get home safe, he said, his voice softening. And keep those papers safe too. The land's yours when I'm gone. I left his cabin around 4:30, figuring I had plenty of time to get back to my car before the sun set. The walking trail wasn't long, and I'd grown up playing in these woods. I knew them like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. The first part of the walk was fine. Birds were singing, squirrels were darting up trees, everything seemed normal. But about halfway to my car, something changed. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a feeling like the woods had suddenly gone a little too quiet. I stopped to tie my shoe, which had come undone. As I bent down, I felt this weird, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I straightened up and looked around, but there was nothing there that I could see, just trees and more trees. Then I heard it, a soft, low whistling. It wasn't like a bird or the wind through the leaves. It was a tune, something slow and deliberate that made my skin crawl. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around me, then behind me, then to my left. Against my better judgment, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The whistling stopped immediately. Complete silence fell over the forest. That's when I remembered Uncle Raph's 3rd rule: don't respond to strange sounds. A little shiver ran through me, but I shook it off. This was stupid. It was probably just some hiker or maybe even the wind playing tricks on me. I started walking again, a bit faster this time. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger. Every few steps I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. About a 1/4 mile further down the trail, I stopped again. Not because I wanted to, but because something caught my eye between the trees to my right. At first, I thought it was just a shadow or maybe a deer, but when I looked directly at it, I froze. There, partly hidden behind a large oak, was what looked like a person, except it wasn't quite right. It was too tall, too thin, with limbs that seemed a little too long for its body, and its face. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw was an unnaturally wide smile and eyes that seemed to glow slightly in the dimness of the forest. I blinked, and it was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild because of Uncle Raph's stupid stories. I picked up my pace again, suddenly very aware of how the shadows were getting longer as the afternoon wore on. The whistling started again, this time from directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't call out. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A woman's scream, high and terrified, coming from somewhere deep in the woods to my left. It cut off abruptly, like someone had clamped a hand over her mouth. "Hello?" I called out before I could stop myself. "Is someone hurt? Do you need help?" Silence, complete, oppressive silence. I stood there for a moment, torn between going to investigate and getting the hell out of there. Common sense won out, and I decided to keep heading for my car. But as I turned back to the trail, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but the distinct sound of someone walking through the underbrush behind me. Heavy steps, deliberately placed, and getting closer. I remembered Uncle Raft's fourth rule. Don't run from footsteps. But as they got closer and closer, my nerve broke. I ran. The moment I started running, the footsteps behind me changed from a walk to a run too, crashing through the forest in pursuit. I could hear breathing now, harsh and ragged, getting closer by the second. My lungs were burning, my legs pumping as fast as they could, but somehow I knew I wasn't going to outrun whatever was behind me. I felt something, a hand, a claw, I don't know, grab at the back of my jacket. I twisted away, but not before feeling a sharp pain across the back of my neck. Hot breath hit my skin, smelling of rot and decay. I broke through the tree line and saw my car parked on the dirt road ahead. With a final burst of speed, I sprinted for it, fumbling for my keys as I ran. The footsteps were right behind me now, so close I was afraid to look back. I reached my car, yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it in one frantic motion. I sat there, gasping for breath, too afraid to look out the windows. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The car started, and I floored it, gravel spraying as I tore down the dirt road. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the forest. That same tall, thin silhouette with the too wide smile. Then I rounded a bend, and it was out of sight. I don't remember much of the drive home. I was in a state of panic the whole time, constantly checking my mirrors to make sure nothing was following me. When I finally got back to my apartment, I locked every door and window, drew all the blinds, and sat in my bathroom with the lights on all night, too terrified to sleep. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. The woods can play tricks on you, especially when you've just had someone fill your head with superstitious nonsense. I was about to chalk the whole thing up to an overactive imagination when I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. Across the back of my neck were 3 long, deep scratches, crusted with dried blood. They were exactly where I'd felt that sharp pain while running. I called Uncle Raft's house, but there was no answer. I tried several times throughout the day, growing more worried with each unanswered call. Finally, around 5 p.m., my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Uncle Raft was standing there. He looked even worse than he had the day before, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes, but he was smiling, which seemed odd given how sick he looked. "Uncle Raft," I said, surprised. "I've been trying to call you all day. Are you okay? How did you get here?" "I'm fine," he said, still smiling. "Just came to check on you, make sure you got home safe yesterday." Something felt off. Uncle Raft never drove into town. He hated driving and hadn't left his property in years as far as I knew. "Yeah, I got home fine," I lied. "Come in." He stepped inside, and I noticed he moved differently than usual, smoother, almost gliding, and he kept looking around my apartment with an expression I couldn't quite place, like he was seeing it for the first time. We sat in my living room, and he asked about the property papers, which I showed him. The whole time, something kept nagging at me, something not quite right about him. It wasn't until he looked directly at me while asking about my walk home that I realized what it was. His eyes. They weren't Uncle Raft's warm brown eyes. They were yellowish green, with pupils that seemed slightly too big. The same eyes I'd glimpsed on that thing in the forest. I tried to keep my expression neutral, remembering Rule 2, don't acknowledge anything unusual. "It was fine," I said. "No problems at all." He nodded, that same fixed smile never leaving his face. "Good, good. Well, I should be heading back. It's a long drive." I walked him to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. As he was leaving, He turned back to me. "You should come visit again soon. The forest misses you." The way he said it made my skin crawl. I just nodded and closed the door behind him, then watched through the peephole as he walked to an old truck I'd never seen before and drove away. I immediately called my mom. "Did Uncle Raft mention he was coming to town today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Raft?" she said, sounding confused. "No, honey. The hospice nurse called me this morning. He's too weak to get out of bed now. They don't think he has much time left." My blood turned to ice. If Uncle Raft was bedridden at his cabin, then who or what had just been in my apartment? I hung up and went to the window, looking out at the street where Uncle Raft had parked. The truck was gone, but across the street, standing at the edge of the small wooded area that borders my apartment complex, was a tall, thin figure. It was just standing there, partially hidden by a tree, watching my window. As I stared, it raised one unnaturally long arm and waved at me, that too-wide smile visible even from a distance. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. That was 3 weeks ago. Uncle Raft died 2 days later. I couldn't bring myself to go to the funeral, couldn't face going back into those woods, not even in daylight with other people around. I've been seeing that thing everywhere since then. Just glimpses, a flash of movement at the edge of my vision, a tall silhouette visible for a split second when I turn on a light at night, that awful whistling tune coming from just outside my window. Last night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open, even though I distinctly remember closing and locking it before I went to bed. And there, in the doorway, was a silhouette, tall, thin, with limbs just a little too long. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. I shut my eyes tight and pulled the covers over my head like a child, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. When I finally got the courage to look again, the doorway was empty. But scratched into the wood of my bedroom door, from the outside, were 4 words: "The forest misses you." I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I keep thinking about those 4 rules Uncle Raft told me and how I broke every single one of them. And I keep thinking about those papers he gave me. The deed to land that's been in my family for generations. Land deep in those woods where things that aren't natural have been living for longer than us and will be there long after. I think it's calling me back. I think it wants me to come home. And the worst part is, sometimes I find myself wanting to go. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 3 years now, and I still get the shakes when I think about it. I've never told anyone except my girlfriend, and she thinks I should talk to someone about it. So here I am. I guess typing it out might help me process what happened that night. I grew up in a small town about 40 miles north of Anchorage. It's the kind of place where everybody knows each other's business, and hunting isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. My dad's been taking me hunting since I was 7. By the time I was 16, I could field dress a deer faster than most of the grown men in our town. Dad always said I was a natural, but the truth is, I just paid attention to everything he taught me. That fall, just after I turned 21, my dad hurt his back pretty bad at the construction site where he worked. Slipped disc. Doctor said he'd be out of commission for at least 6 months. No heavy lifting, no long walks, and definitely no hunting. This crushed him. October is prime hunting season here, and Dad never missed a season in 30 years. One morning, about a week before Dad's birthday, Mom pulled me aside while he was still sleeping. "Your father's more depressed than he'll admit," she whispered. "His birthday's coming up, and I was thinking, what if you went hunting and brought something back for him? It would mean the world to him. I hesitated. I'd never been hunting alone before. Dad was always there, leading the way, making the decisions. But I wasn't a kid anymore, and I knew all the spots well enough. Plus, I'd seen how Dad winced every time someone mentioned hunting season. So I agreed. The plan was simple. I'd leave early on a Friday morning, spend the day hunting, camp overnight, and hopefully return with something on Saturday. Dad's birthday was Sunday, so the timing was perfect. Mom would tell him I was helping a buddy move some furniture, which would explain my absence. I packed everything the night before. My rifle, a Remington 700 that Dad got me for my 18th birthday, ammo, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, knife, and all the other essentials. I double-checked my gear 3 times because Dad's voice was in my head. Being unprepared in the Alaskan wilderness isn't just stupid, it's suicide. I set off at 5:30 a.m. that Friday. The drive to our usual spot took about an hour. It's a remote area with decent access via a logging road that's been abandoned for years. Dad and I always had good luck there. Mostly deer, sometimes moose if we were patient. The morning was crisp, with that clean Alaskan air that makes your lungs feel like they're working for the first time. I parked where we always did, at the end of the logging road. From there, it was a 2-mile hike to get to the good hunting grounds. I shouldered my pack, grabbed my rifle, and started walking. By midday, I'd covered a lot of ground but hadn't seen much worth shooting. A few doe, but I was hoping for a buck to really make Dad proud. I pushed deeper into the woods than Dad and I usually went. I figured the animals might be less skittish farther in. As the afternoon wore on, I started getting concerned. The sun sets early in Alaska in October, and I needed to find a suitable campsite before dark. Around 4:30 p.m., I came across a small clearing that looked perfect. It was maybe 30 feet across, relatively flat, with a small stream about 50 yards away. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cleared a space for a small fire. Nothing big, just enough to keep the insects away and provide a little comfort. I wasn't worried about bears this late in the season, but I still hung my food from a branch about 100 feet from my tent, just like Dad taught me. After eating some beef jerky and a granola bar, I sat by the fire for a while, cleaning my rifle and listening to the woods. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. I remember thinking this solo hunting trip wasn't so bad after all. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 8:30 p.m. The temperature was dropping fast, but I was warm enough in my gear. I fell asleep almost immediately, tired from the day's hike. I woke up suddenly. My watch said 11:42 p.m. Something had disturbed my sleep, but I wasn't sure what. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint red glow on the walls of my tent. Then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. Then another. Something was moving around out there. My first thought was bear, but it didn't sound heavy enough. The footsteps were too light, almost deliberate. I reached for my rifle, which I always keep within arm's reach when camping. More sounds followed, rustling grass, another twig, what sounded like breathing. Whatever it was circling my campsite. I sat up slowly, trying not to make noise. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, silence, complete silence. Even the normal nighttime forest sounds, insects, the occasional owl, had stopped. It was like the whole woods was holding its breath. I waited, gripping my rifle, for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes. The silence was almost worse than the noises. At least with the noises I could track whatever was out there. Finally, I started to relax. Maybe it was just a deer or some other harmless animal. Maybe it had moved on. I laid back down, though I kept my rifle close. Just as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard another twig snap, closer this time. And then, hello, a child's voice, clear as day, right outside my tent. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up. There shouldn't be a child out here. We were miles from the nearest road, in the middle of nowhere. Hello. The same voice, the same intonation. Exactly the same. Like a recording being played back. There was something wrong about it. Something mechanical and lifeless. I sat up again, this time raising my rifle and pointing it toward the voice. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative despite my fear. No response, just silence again. "I'm armed," I warned. "Identify yourself." More silence. Then, from a slightly different direction, "Hello." That's when I noticed something odd about the embers of my fire. They seemed to be dimming, as if something was blocking their light from outside the tent. Before I could process what that meant, my tent wall ripped open with a sound like tearing fabric. Dark claws, at least that's what my brain registered them as, tore through the nylon like it was tissue paper. And then I saw it. God, I wish I hadn't seen it. The creature was humanoid, but definitely not human. Its skin was a sickly ash gray, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Its eyes were pure white, no pupils, no irises, just milky orbs that somehow still seemed to focus on me. Its head was hairless, covered in what looked like pockmarks or small craters. But its mouth, Jesus, its mouth was the worst part. A slack jaw that hung open too wide, dripping some kind of viscous slime that glistened in the dying firelight. I didn't think. I just reacted. I fired my rifle directly at its chest. The sound was deafening in the small tent. The creature stumbled backward with the impact. It made a noise, not a scream or a growl, but a high-pitched whine that sounded electronic, like feedback from a microphone. Then it collapsed just outside my torn tent. I sat there for a few seconds, ears ringing from the gunshot, body trembling. Then survival instinct kicked in. I needed to make sure it was dead. If it wasn't, I needed to finish it off. I crawled out of the tent, rifle ready. The clearing was dimly lit by the moon and the dying embers. I could see where the creature had fallen. There was a small pool of something dark that I assumed was blood, but the creature itself was gone. I spun around, searching the darkness. Nothing. Just the trees swaying slightly in the breeze, and that small puddle of what I now saw wasn't blood at all. It was the same viscous slime that had been dripping from its mouth, black in the moonlight. I don't know how long I stood there, scanning the woods, before I realized I was making myself a target. If that thing was still alive, still out there, I was exposed. I grabbed my sleeping bag from the tent and my backpack, which thankfully had most of my gear already packed. I left the tent. I wasn't about to waste time taking it down, and I never wanted to see it again anyway. I checked that my rifle was fully loaded, turned on my flashlight, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going at first. Just away from that clearing, away from whatever the hell that thing was. I walked for maybe 15 minutes before stopping to get my bearings. I checked my compass and realized I was heading roughly east, away from the logging road where my truck was parked. I corrected my course and kept moving. Every sound in the forest made me jump. Every shadow looked like that creature. I walked through the night, stopping only when absolutely necessary to check the compass or drink some water. As dawn broke, I finally saw something familiar, a distinctive rock formation that Dad and I used as a landmark. I was getting close to the logging road. I picked up my pace, fueled by the growing light and the promise of safety. I reached my truck around 6:30 a.m. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key in the ignition. Once I did, I locked the doors and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had happened. Had I really seen what I thought I had? Could it have been a person in some kind of costume? A hallucination from eating something bad? None of those explanations made sense. The way it moved wasn't human. The way it spoke, if you can call repeating hello in that horrible way speaking, wasn't human. I drove home in a daze. When Mom asked where the game was, I mumbled something about not finding anything worth shooting. She looked disappointed, but said it was the thought that counted. Dad joked that things would have been different if he'd been there, that his lucky hat always brought home a buck. I forced a smile and agreed with him, but secretly I was relieved he hadn't been there. I was relieved his back injury had kept him safe at home, because something is out there in those woods, something evil, something that doesn't belong in our world, and it's smart enough to lure hunters with a child's voice. I've never told my parents what happened. What would I say? That I encountered some kind of monster? They'd think I was crazy or that I was making up stories to cover for my failure to bring home a deer. So I've kept it to myself. I've made excuses every time Dad's mentioned going hunting again since his back healed. School commitments, work, anything to avoid those woods. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has encountered it. If there are other hunters who've disappeared in that area over the years. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but who would believe me? What would I even report? Officer, I saw a monster in the woods that said hello like a broken record. All I know is I'm never going back there. And if you hunt in Alaska, stay close to the roads. Don't go deep into those woods. Don't camp alone. And if you hear a child's voice where no child should be, run. Run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. Because that thing, whatever it was, is still out there. And next time, it might not miss. I never believed in the paranormal before that night. Sure, I'd watched horror movies and enjoyed a good ghost story around the campfire, but I always chalked those up to overactive imaginations or people mistaking normal things for something supernatural. That all changed last summer. It was June 2019, and I was driving with my two best friends, Hannah and Chris, through the back roads of eastern Tennessee. We were headed back to our Airbnb after a day of hiking in the Appalachians. It must have been around 10:30 p.m., and those mountain roads get pitch black once the sun goes down. There are no streetlights out there, just the endless darkness of the forest pressing in from all sides. I was behind the wheel of my old Honda Civic. Chris was riding shotgun, scrolling through Spotify trying to find the perfect song for our mountain vibe. Hannah was in the back seat, half asleep and scrolling through Instagram. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness as we wound our way along those twisting roads. We were talking about the hike we'd just completed, laughing about how Chris had nearly stepped on a snake and how Hannah had complained the entire time about the bugs. It was just a normal night with friends. Nothing felt off or weird. The radio was playing softly, and we were all tired but happy. I remember the exact moment everything changed. We rounded a bend, and my headlights caught something in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. At first, I thought it was just a rock or maybe some debris, but as we got closer, I realized it was an animal. "There's something in the road," I said, slowing down. I wasn't worried. Animals usually dart away when a car approaches, but this one didn't move. Not even a twitch. Chris looked up from his phone. "What is it? A deer?" "No, it's smaller." Maybe a cat or something, I replied, easing off the gas even more. We were probably going about 10 mph at this point, but the animal still didn't budge. As we inched closer, I got my first good look at it, and immediately my stomach dropped. Something was very wrong with what I was seeing. The creature was about the size of a large house cat, but its proportions were off. Its body was low to the ground, almost pressed against the asphalt, but not in a crouching way. More like that was its natural stance. The strangest thing was its fur. In the headlights, it looked flesh-colored. Not pink exactly, but a weird, sickly beige that didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen before. It had small ears like a kitten, but they were positioned strangely on its head. And then there were the eyes. God, those eyes. They reflected my headlights, but not in the normal way animal eyes do. They were bright red-orange with little yellow twinkles inside them, like there were actual flames burning in its eye sockets. I know how that sounds, but that's exactly what it looked like the pits of hell were burning inside this thing's head. The creature remained completely motionless as we approached. Not the frozen in fear kind of motionless that you'd expect from an animal caught in headlights. This was different. It was like it was deliberately standing its ground, watching us. "What the hell is that?" Chris whispered, leaning forward in his seat. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had gone completely dry. The car was now crawling along at maybe 5 mph, and we were almost upon the creature. "Just go around it," Chris suggested, his voice unusually tight. I nodded and carefully steered to the left to give the thing a wide berth. As we passed by, it still didn't move, not even to turn its head to follow our car. Those burning eyes just stared straight ahead at where we had been. No one in the car spoke as we passed it. I glanced in my rear-view mirror, and the creature was still there, motionless in the middle of the road. The red-orange glow of its eyes was visible even from behind. We had driven maybe 5 seconds past it when Chris suddenly yelled, "What the fuck was that?" His outburst made me jump, and I nearly swerved off the road. Hannah, who had been looking at her phone and hadn't seen the creature, jerked her head up. "What? What happened?" "That thing back there," Chris said, twisting in his seat to look out the rear window. "Leo, pull over. I want to get a picture." "No way," I said firmly, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep driving, to get as far away from that thing as possible. Hannah was leaning between the front seats now, trying to see out the back window. "What did you guys see?" "There was this weird cat thing in the road," Chris explained, still looking back. "It had these freaky eyes and didn't move at all." Hannah turned to look out the rear window. "I don't see anything." I checked my rearview mirror again, and she was right. The road behind us was empty. The creature was gone. "It was just there," I said, feeling a chill run up my spine. It was literally just sitting in the middle of the road. "Well, it's not there now," Hannah said. "What did it look like?" As Chris described what we'd seen, I kept driving, pushing the speed limit a bit more than I should have on those winding roads. Something about that creature had deeply unsettled me. It wasn't just that it looked strange. There was something fundamentally wrong about it, like it didn't belong in our world. "Maybe it was a bobcat," Hannah suggested when Chris finished. "They can look weird in headlights." "It wasn't a bobcat," I said, shaking my head. "I've seen bobcats before. This wasn't that." "Mountain lion?" She tried again. "No," Chris and I said in unison. "It was the size of a house cat," I explained. "But it didn't look like any cat I've ever seen. Its fur was like the color of skin. And those eyes, they looked like they were on fire," Chris finished for me, "like literally burning." Hannah was quiet for a moment. You guys are freaking me out. Are you sure it wasn't just some normal animal that looked weird because of the headlights? I know what I saw, I insisted, though I was already starting to doubt myself. Had the creature really looked that bizarre, or was my mind exaggerating it now? When we got back to the Airbnb, Hannah's mom was still up. She was staying in the area too, visiting some relatives while we did our hiking trip. She was sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, enjoying the cool mountain air. "How was the hike?" she asked as we trudged up the steps. "Great," Hannah replied, "but Leo and Chris think they saw some kind of demon cat on the drive back." I shot her an annoyed look, but her mom's reaction caught me completely off guard. The smile dropped from her face, and she set her wine glass down with a shaky hand. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. "Exactly what did it look like?" Chris and I exchanged glances. Then I described the creature again. The flesh-colored fur, the kitten-like ears, the burning eyes, how it had stayed completely still as we drove around it. Hannah's mom had gone pale. "Where was this?" she asked. I told her the approximate location, about 15 miles east of the Airbnb, on that winding back road that cuts through the forest. She sat back in her chair, staring off into the darkness beyond the porch. "I saw it too," she said quietly, 30 years ago. The four of us sat in stunned silence for a moment. Hannah was the first to speak. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Her mom took a long sip of wine before answering. "I was about your age, maybe 19 or 20. My cousin and I were driving through the mountains not far from where you saw it. It wasn't in the road for us, though. It was peeking out from some bushes by the side of the road." "Are you serious right now?" Hannah asked, looking between her mom and us, like she was waiting for someone to admit this was all a joke. "Dead serious," her mom replied. "It had that same strange skin-colored fur, those small ears, and the eyes, just like you described, like the pits of hell burning inside them." My skin crawled as she echoed almost exactly what I'd thought when I saw the creature. "What did you do?" I asked. "We kept driving," she said. "My cousin saw it too, and we both agreed never to take that road again. We told my grandfather about it later, and he got real quiet. He was part Cherokee, and he said there were things in these mountains that had been here long before people arrived. Things that didn't like us very much." Chris leaned forward. "What things?" "Did he know what it was?" Hannah's mom shook her head. "He wouldn't talk about it anymore after that. Just told us to stay on the main roads and not to go into the forest at night." We stayed up late that night, searching online for any information about strange creatures in the Appalachian Mountains. We found plenty of folklore, tales of the Wampus cat, the Cherokee death cat, various cryptids that supposedly haunted the area, but nothing that matched exactly what we had seen. The next morning, in the daylight, it was easier to be skeptical. Maybe it had just been a normal animal that looked strange in the headlights. Maybe Hannah's mom was just humoring us or had seen something different all those years ago. But deep down, I knew better. There was something about those burning eyes that I couldn't explain away. We completed our vacation without any other strange encounters, but I couldn't stop thinking about what we'd seen. Back home, I continued researching, reaching out to local historical societies and even a couple of cryptozoologists. Most dismissed my story or offered mundane explanations. A bobcat with an eye condition, a fox with mange that made its fur look strange. But a few people reached out with similar stories, not identical, but close enough to make me believe that whatever we saw that night, others had encountered it too. It's been over a year now, and I still don't have an explanation for what we saw on that Tennessee back road. I've gone back and forth between rational explanations and supernatural ones, but nothing quite fits. Chris refuses to talk about it anymore. He says thinking about those eyes gives him nightmares. Hannah still thinks we saw a normal animal and just spooked ourselves despite her mom's story. As for me, I can't forget it. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and my headlights catch something by the side of the road, my heart stops for a second, afraid I'll see that flesh-colored creature with the burning eyes again. I don't know what it was, some unknown species, a spirit or something else entirely, but I know what I saw was real. And sometimes late at night, I find myself wondering, if it was there in 2019 and it was there 30 years before that, is it still out there in those mountains, waiting for someone else to drive by? I still have nightmares about what happened in those mountains last summer. I'm 12 now, and my parents think I just had a scary experience in the woods, that my imagination blew out of proportion. But they weren't there. They didn't see what we saw. My family's from California, but my mom's sister and her husband own this cabin in central Idaho, deep in the Rocky Mountains. It's pretty isolated. The nearest town is like 40 minutes away by car. I was excited when my parents said my sister Emma and I could spend 2 weeks there with our cousins. The cabin itself is cool. It's got this massive back porch that looks right over this freezing cold river, and directly across is this huge mountain covered in dense forest. The day we arrived was brutally hot, which I didn't expect in Idaho. My Uncle Bill picked us up from the airport and drove us out to the cabin. My 3 cousins, Alex, 16, Mia, 14, and Jake, 11, were waiting for us when we got there. We spent that first day just hanging out, swimming in the shallow parts of the river where it was safe, and getting settled in. My aunt and uncle had this guest room on the 2nd floor for Emma and me. It had these big windows facing the mountain. That night, it was still so hot that I couldn't sleep. Must have been around midnight when I finally got up and opened the window, hoping to get some breeze. The sound of the river was actually pretty soothing. I was just about to climb back into bed when I heard it for the first time. It's really hard to describe that sound. It started as this high-pitched wail that turned into this raspy, guttural screech. It echoed across the valley, coming from somewhere deep in those woods across the river. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. Definitely not a cougar, or wolf, or bear. It wasn't human either, not even close. It was like if pure hatred could make a sound. That's the best way I can put it. I ran to Emma's bed and shook her awake, but by the time she sat up, the sound had stopped. She thought I was just trying to scare her and told me to go back to sleep. I closed the window and lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to look outside again. The next morning at breakfast, I asked my uncle if there were any dangerous animals in the woods. He said there were black bears and mountain lions, but they usually avoided people. When I tried to describe the sound I'd heard, he just laughed and said it was probably just an elk, or maybe even the wind playing tricks on me. My cousins seemed more interested, especially Alex, who'd always been into hunting and tracking. Did it sound like this? Alex pulled out his phone and played some YouTube videos of different animal calls, but none of them matched what I'd heard. That afternoon, after lunch, Alex suggested we go explore the mountain. My aunt was hesitant at first, but Alex promised we'd be back before dark, and he knew those woods well. Plus, he was going to bring his pistol just in case. My uncle had taught him to shoot years ago. I could tell my aunt wasn't thrilled about the gun, but she finally agreed, telling us to stay together and bring our phones. I packed a small backpack with water, some granola bars, and a flashlight. I also grabbed this hunting knife my uncle had given me earlier that day. He'd seen me eyeing his collection and thought I might like to have one. It made me feel a little safer, especially after what I'd heard the night before. We crossed the footbridge about half a mile downstream from the cabin and started our hike up the mountain. The forest was dense, tall pines and spruce trees blocking out most of the sunlight. It was cooler under the canopy, which was a relief after the previous day's heat. "This is bear country," Alex warned as we climbed. "Make noise so we don't surprise anything." For the first couple hours, the hike was actually fun. We saw deer tracks, some interesting birds, and even a small waterfall trickling down a rock face. But as we got higher, the trees got thicker and the trail narrowed. There wasn't really a path anymore, just areas where the undergrowth wasn't as dense. I kept checking my phone for the time. We'd promised to be back before dark, but I realized we'd hiked much farther than planned. It was already 5:30 p.m. "Alex, shouldn't we head back?" Emma asked, clearly getting tired. "We're almost to the summit," Alex insisted. "The view from up there is amazing. It'll be worth it, I promise. Then we can head straight back down." We pushed on, and about 20 minutes later, we reached the top. Alex was right. The view was incredible. We could see the cabin far below, the river snaking through the valley, and mountains stretching for miles in every direction. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. "Okay, time to head back," Alex said after we'd rested for a few minutes and taken some pictures. "We'll take a more direct route down. It's steeper but faster." We started our descent, moving quickly now. The forest seemed different on this side of the mountain, darker, with more undergrowth and fallen trees to navigate around. About halfway down, I started to get this feeling. It's hard to explain, but it was like that sensation when you know someone's watching you. I stopped and looked around, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The others had gotten a bit ahead of me. "Guys, wait up," I called, hurrying to catch them. That's when we heard it again, that same horrible screech I'd heard the night before. But this time it was much louder, much closer, and it wasn't just a single cry. It continued, rising and falling in pitch, almost like it was communicating something. "What the hell was that?" Mia gasped. Even Alex looked scared now. "I don't know, but we need to move. Now." We started moving faster, almost running down the steep slope, grabbing onto trees to keep from falling. The sounds continued, and they seemed to be getting closer. Then we heard something else. Footsteps. Heavy, fast footsteps crashing through the underbrush, maybe 30 yards behind us. "It's following us," Emma cried. Alex pulled out his pistol. "Keep moving. I'll be right behind you." He fired 2 shots into the air. The footsteps stopped momentarily, but then they resumed, even faster than before. "It didn't scare it off," Alex said, his voice shaking. "Just run." We ran as fast as we could down that mountain. Jake tripped and skinned his knee badly, but Alex pulled him up and we kept going. The thing behind us was getting closer. We could hear branches breaking, leaves rustling, and that terrible screeching growing louder. As we neared the bottom of the mountain, I risked a glance back. Through the trees, I saw movement. Something large, moving on 2 legs. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I recognized. "The bridge is still half a mile downstream," Alex panted as we reached the edge of the forest. "We'll never make it before that thing catches up." The river stretched before us, about 30 feet across, with a strong current. On the other side was the relative safety of the open land leading to the cabin. "We have to swim across," Alex decided. "It's our only chance." None of us argued. We could hear the creature getting closer, and now we could see its shadow moving between the trees at the forest edge. "Drop your backpacks," Alex commanded. "Keep your phones if you can. On 3, we all go in together." The water was shockingly cold, like being stabbed with 1,000 ice needles at once. The current was strong, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me downstream. I'm a decent swimmer, but this was terrifying. Jake was struggling, so Mia and Alex helped him. Somehow we all made it to the other side, soaking wet and freezing, but alive. We dragged ourselves onto the opposite bank and turned back toward the forest. That's when we finally saw it clearly. Standing at the edge of the trees was, I don't even know how to describe it. It was tall, 7 feet at least. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, but it stood upright on 2 legs. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, ending in hands with claws like a bear's, but longer, more like razors. Its face, God, its face was the worst part. It had this elongated snout filled with jagged teeth, and its eyes glowed red in the dimming light. It paced back and forth at the river's edge like it was considering whether to cross. Alex raised his gun with shaking hands and fired twice. I don't know if he hit it or not, but the creature let out one final ear-splitting screech that made my blood turn to ice, then turned and disappeared back into the forest. We ran all the way back to the cabin, soaking wet and crying. My aunt and uncle were frantic when they saw us. We tried to explain what had happened, but our stories came out jumbled and hysterical. My uncle grabbed his rifle and drove down to the bridge, crossing over to check the area where we'd seen the creature. He came back an hour later, saying he hadn't found anything except some broken branches and what might have been large footprints, but it was too dark to tell for sure. That night, my aunt and uncle let all 5 of us sleep in the living room together. None of us wanted to be alone. I lay awake most of the night, listening for that screech again, but it never came. The next morning, my uncle and a couple of his friends went back to search the area in daylight. They found some strange tracks near where we'd seen the creature. Large, deep impressions that my uncle said didn't match any animal he knew. But they dismissed it as probably a bear that had been standing on its hind legs. My parents wanted to come get us early after hearing what happened, but my aunt and uncle convinced them it was just a scary experience with likely a bear. We stayed the full 2 weeks, but none of us would go near that mountain again. At night, we kept all the windows closed despite the heat. I never heard that screech again during our stay, but sometimes when I was alone, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the forest across the river. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe. It's been 4 months since then. I still have nightmares about those glowing red eyes and that horrible sound. My parents think I just had a scary encounter that my imagination turned into something more. My sister doesn't like to talk about it. I tried looking online to see if anyone else had reported seeing something similar in that area, but I haven't found much. I don't know what we saw that day. All I know is that it wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or any normal animal. Whatever it was, it hunted us. It was intelligent enough to track us, to try to cut us off from the bridge. And those eyes, those weren't the eyes of an animal. I'm never going back to those mountains. And if you ever find yourself in the forests of central Idaho and you hear a high-pitched, raspy screech echoing through the trees, run. Don't look back. Just run. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night last March. I've tried telling a few friends, but they either think I'm making it up or they say I was just tired and imagining things. I know what I saw, though, what our whole family saw. We live about 15 miles outside of Gallup, New Mexico, on a small piece of land my grandfather bought back in the 70s. It's nothing fancy, just a simple house with some land around it. We keep chickens in a hen house my dad built a few years ago, and we've got a couple of dogs that usually keep the coyotes and other predators away. My uncle lives with us too, along with my grandmother, who's been with us since my grandfather passed. That night started like any other. We had dinner around 6:30. My mom made her famous green chili stew, and afterward, my dad and uncle sat in the living room watching a basketball game while I helped Mom clean up. My little brother was playing some game on his phone, and Grandma was knitting in her rocking chair like she always does in the evenings. Around 10 p.m., we were all getting ready for bed when the dogs started going crazy outside. I mean, they bark at stuff all the time, rabbits, coyotes, sometimes even just the wind. But this was different. Rex and Luna were making this weird mix of barking and whining I'd never heard before. They sounded scared, not just alert. Dad looked at my Uncle Joe and said, "We better check it out." I grabbed my jacket and followed them outside, and my younger brother Marco came too, even though Dad told him to stay inside. The night was clear and cold, with a bright moon overhead that cast sharp shadows across our yard. The dogs were at the edge of the property near the trees, barking toward the darkness beyond. They wouldn't go any closer to the tree line, which was weird because normally Rex will chase anything. "Probably coyotes trying to get at the chickens again," Uncle Joe said, shining his flashlight toward the hen house. The light beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything moving out there. We walked over to check on the hen house first. Everything looked secure. The gate was closed, and I could hear the chickens inside, sounding slightly agitated but not panicked. Dad rattled the latch just to be sure. "Let's check the trees," he said, and we moved toward where the dogs were still barking. As we got closer, Rex suddenly stopped barking and started whining, backing up behind us. Luna did the same. That's when I saw movement among the trees, just a flash of something ducking behind a trunk about 30 yards in. It was quick, but in the moonlight it looked tall. "There's something there," I said, pointing. Dad and Uncle Joe peered into the darkness. "Could be a coyote," Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. Uncle Joe picked up a rock and threw it toward where I'd seen the movement. The rock hit a tree with a loud crack. Something rustled in the branches, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dark move between two trees. "You see that?" I asked. "Probably just scared it off," Uncle Joe said, though he was squinting like he was trying to get a better look. We stood there for a few more minutes, listening and watching. The dogs had calmed down a bit but were still on edge. After not seeing anything else, Dad decided we should head back inside. "Whatever it was, it's gone now. Let's get some sleep." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched as we walked back to the house. I kept turning around, expecting to catch something following us, but there was nothing there, just the moonlight and shadows. Back inside, Grandma was waiting by the window. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was worried. She just asked if everything was okay, and Dad told her it was probably just a coyote. I tried to fall asleep, but my mind kept replaying what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen, in the trees. It was around 1:30 a.m. when I finally started drifting off. Then it happened. The sound jolted me awake, a violent rustling from the direction of the trees, like someone was thrashing through the branches. But this wasn't some animal moving through underbrush. The noise was up high in the tops of the pines that border our property. Branches were snapping and limbs were whipping against each other violently. It sounded like something big was moving through the treetops. Our dogs erupted into frenzied barking again. I jumped out of bed and ran to my window, which faces the back of our property. I couldn't see much in the darkness, but the trees were definitely moving, their tops swaying unnaturally, despite there being hardly any wind. Dad was already in the hallway when I opened my door. Uncle Joe came out of his room a second later, and Marco was right behind him. "What the hell is that?" Uncle Joe asked, pulling on his boots. "Get the flashlights." Dad said to me as he grabbed his jacket. We rushed outside, this time all of us, including my mom, who stood nervously on the porch. The dogs were going absolutely ballistic, but still wouldn't approach the tree line. They were running back and forth along an invisible boundary, like they couldn't or wouldn't cross it. But here's the weird part. By the time we got outside, everything had gone silent again. The violent rustling had completely stopped. The trees were still. It was like someone had hit a pause button on whatever had been happening. We stood in the yard, flashlight beams scanning the tree line, but there was nothing to see. No movement, no sounds except for the continued anxious whining of our dogs. Maybe it was a mountain lion, Marco suggested, his voice shaking slightly. Dad shook his head. Mountain lions don't climb to the tops of trees like that. Let's check the hen house, Uncle Joe said, and we walked over, flashlights leading the way. The chickens sounded normal, that soft, sleeping, clucking sound they make at night. The gate was still secured, the door still closed. Everything looked exactly as it had earlier. We stayed outside for at least 30 minutes, watching and listening. Dad and Uncle Joe took turns walking the perimeter of our property, but they didn't find anything unusual. Eventually the dogs calmed down, though they kept looking toward the trees like they were expecting something to happen. Whatever it was, it's gone now, Dad finally said. Let's try to get some sleep. We'll check everything again in the morning. I barely slept the rest of the night. I kept my curtains open, watching the tree line until the first hint of dawn started lighting up the sky. I must have drifted off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning and I could hear Dad and Uncle Joe talking outside. I threw on some clothes and rushed out. They were standing by the hen house, and even from the porch, I could tell something was wrong by the way they were standing. When I got closer, I saw it. The gate to the chicken yard was wide open, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. The door to the hen house itself was open too. Inside it was empty. Every single chicken was gone. Could be coyotes, Dad said, but he didn't sound convinced, though I've never seen them open a latch before. We started searching for signs of what might have happened. That's when things got really weird. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the hen house. Not animal prints like you'd expect from a coyote or fox. These were bipedal footprints, like something walking on two legs. But they weren't normal human footprints either. They were elongated and narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. They went back and forth between the trees and our outhouse, like whatever made them had been pacing. But the strangest thing was around the hen house itself. Despite all 20 of our chickens being missing, there were only chicken tracks in the dirt. No predator tracks at all, as if the chickens had just walked out on their own. "What the hell?" Uncle Joe kept saying, crouching down to examine the weird footprints. We followed the tracks to the edge of the tree line, where they simply vanished. Not like something had covered them up. They just stopped, as if whatever made them had suddenly taken flight or disappeared into thin air. That's when I noticed Grandma standing at the back door, watching us. Her face was pale, and she was gripping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. When we came back to the house, she was waiting in the kitchen. "It was a skinwalker," she said quietly in Navajo. "My grandmother doesn't speak English much, even though she understands it. She prefers to stick to Navajo, especially when she's upset." The room went silent. I've grown up hearing stories about skinwalkers, evil witches from Navajo beliefs who can take the form of animals. They're feared even by people who claim not to believe in the old ways, but I'd always thought of them as just stories meant to scare kids into behaving. "Shimasani," I started, using the Navajo word for grandmother. "Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. I saw it from my window, tall, not a person, not an animal, moving wrong. She made a gesture with her hands that somehow conveyed something unnatural. It called the chickens out. They followed it like it was their friend. A chill ran down my spine. I remembered how the chickens had sounded normal last night when we checked them, not panicked like they would be with a predator. Grandma went to her room and came back with a small pouch of what I knew was corn pollen, a sacred substance used in Navajo prayers and ceremonies. She walked slowly outside, and we followed her. At the edge of our property, facing the trees, she sprinkled some of the pollen on the ground and began a prayer in Navajo. When she finished, she turned to us. "Now all of you must yell in Navajo, 'Go away, go bother someone else.'" We did as she instructed, even Marco, who usually rolls his eyes at the traditional stuff. We all shouted the Navajo phrase toward the trees, our voices echoing in the morning air. After that, Grandma insisted we go inside and that no one should go near the tree line for at least a day. Dad wanted to report the missing chickens to the tribal police, but Grandma was adamant that we shouldn't. "Drawing attention brings it back," she said. That night we closed all the curtains and blinds. Grandma put small pouches of herbs above each door and window. The dogs stayed inside with us, which they never do normally. Nothing happened that night or in the days that followed. Dad built a new, more secure hen house closer to the main house, and eventually we got new chickens. But sometimes, when I look out toward those trees, especially at dusk, I swear I can see something moving just at the edge of my vision. Something tall and not quite natural. We never found our chickens or any remains. No feathers, no blood, nothing. They were just gone, like they'd never existed. And those footprints, I can still see them clearly in my mind. Too long, too narrow to be human, with those strange claw marks at the toes. I don't go out alone at night anymore, and when the dogs start barking at something in the darkness, I make sure all the doors and windows are locked. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, watching us, waiting, and what it might want next time. I still lose sleep thinking about what happened at Piney Creek 4 years ago. My therapist says writing about traumatic experiences can help, so here goes. I've never shared this with anyone outside our group because honestly, who would believe it? It was supposed to be a fun spring break trip. Just me, Leah, my best friend since middle school, Kathy, who we met freshman year, and Jennifer, Leah's cousin who'd recently moved to our town. We weren't party girls, just wanted a few days away from parents and homework before senior year finals crushed us. Leah's dad owned this old camper parked permanently at a private campground about 2 hours from town. It wasn't fancy, just a double-wide trailer thing with 3 small bedrooms, a tiny bathroom, and a kitchen-living room combo. The place was set pretty far back from the other campers, which seemed perfect for us. The drive there was normal. We blasted music, talked about college plans, and Jennifer told us about her old town. She seemed cool but quiet, the kind of person who observes more than she talks. Leah's dad kept making dad jokes the whole way, which was both annoying and comforting somehow. When we finally arrived, the campground was practically empty. Just a few other campers scattered around, mostly older couples. The place had that musty, closed-up smell when we first walked in, but we opened all the windows to air it out. Leah's dad helped us unload the coolers and our bags, then did the whole responsible parent lecture. "No boys, no booze, no wandering off alone," he said with that serious dad face. Then he laughed and added, "Especially no boys." Like that was even an option in the middle of nowhere. He left us his old flip phone since cell service was spotty and promised to pick us up on Sunday afternoon. We watched his truck disappear down the gravel road, and then it was just us. The first weird thing happened while we were unpacking. I was putting food in the tiny fridge when I heard something outside. It wasn't like an animal noise, more like something heavy being dragged. I looked at Leah, who was sorting through her bag on the couch. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She paused for a second, head tilted. The sound came again, a scraping, dragging noise that seemed to circle around the side of the camper. "Probably just the wind moving something," she said, but her voice sounded strange, like she was trying too hard to be casual. What was weirder was how quickly she dismissed it. Leah's normally the jumpy one who makes us check behind shower curtains. I went to the window but couldn't see anything. "Should we check it out?" "No," Leah almost shouted, then immediately softened her tone. "I mean, it's nothing. Let's finish unpacking." Jennifer had claimed the master bedroom immediately upon arrival. "I can't sleep in small spaces," she'd explained. "I get claustrophobic." That left me with the tiny back room, Kathy in the middle one, and Leah on the pull-out couch. I didn't mind. I just wanted to get settled. When I went outside to grab my last bag from the picnic table, Jennifer was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the ground. "Jennifer," I called, "everything okay?" She didn't respond at first. When I got closer, I noticed how rigid her body was, like she was frozen in place. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something behind me. "What are you looking at?" I turned to follow her gaze but saw nothing except trees and shadows. "Don't you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned again, more carefully this time, scanning the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a reddish-black shape, like an orb floating between two pines, but when I blinked, it was gone. When I looked back at Jennifer, her entire demeanor had changed. She smiled brightly, completely relaxed. "Sorry, thought I saw a deer. Let's go inside, I'm starving." The sudden shift freaked me out more than her staring had. It was like someone had flipped a switch inside her, but I followed her back inside, telling myself I was being dramatic. We made spaghetti for dinner, laughing and talking about school drama. Everything felt normal again. After eating, Kathy pulled out cupcakes her mom had made, and we left them on the counter for later. We were too full from dinner to eat them right away. By 11 p.m., we were all tired from the drive and decided to turn in. The camper had thin walls, so I could hear Kathy's TV playing softly in the next room. I knocked on the wall twice, our signal to turn it down, and everything went quiet. Too quiet, actually, like the whole forest had suddenly gone silent. That's when I heard it. A scream, but not human. It was high-pitched and hollow, like it was coming from something that was trying to imitate a human voice, but couldn't quite get it right. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting to hear if anyone else had noticed. Nobody came out of their rooms, so I convinced myself it was just some weird animal. The woods have all kinds of creatures that make strange noises, right? But deep down, I knew this wasn't a fox or a bobcat. This was something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to noises in the kitchen. My phone said 3:17 a.m. At first, I thought maybe someone was getting a midnight snack, but the sounds weren't right. It wasn't the refrigerator opening or silverware clinking. It was more like scratching, methodical, deliberate. I should have pulled the covers over my head. I should have stayed in bed. But I didn't. The hallway was dark as I crept toward the kitchen. A dim light was on above the stove, casting just enough glow to see Jennifer sitting at the table. Her back was to me, perfectly straight, head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. "Jennifer," I whispered, "are you okay?" She didn't turn around. Instead, she made a sound, a weird humming mixed with clicking noises that didn't sound like anything a human throat should produce. I took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the corner by the window was a figure, not just a shadow, but something solid and wrong. It was tall, too tall for the low ceiling, so its head was bent awkwardly. Its proportions were all off, limbs too long and thin. I couldn't make out details because it seemed to absorb the light around it, but I could feel it watching us. The figure was staring at Jennifer, or at least its face was pointed in her direction. I couldn't see eyes, but I felt its attention like a physical weight. Then, slowly, it turned toward me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My body completely locked up, like in those nightmares where danger is coming but you're paralyzed. The scratching sound started again, and I realized it was coming from the figure's hands, long, thin things that weren't quite fingers scraping against the wall. Something in the hallway behind me creaked. The figure's head snapped toward the sound, and in that instant, it moved. Not walked, not ran, but sort of flickered, like a glitch in reality. One moment it was in the corner, the next it was at the window, then it was gone. Jennifer's body slumped forward, her forehead hitting the table with a dull thud. I rushed to her, finally able to move again, and tried to shake her awake. Her skin was ice cold, but she was breathing. "Help!" I screamed. "Somebody help me!" Leah and Kathy came running. We tried everything to wake Jennifer, shaking her, cold water, even a slap across the face that Kathy immediately apologized for. Nothing worked. She wasn't unconscious exactly. Her eyes were open, but vacant, staring at nothing. "What happened?" Leah demanded, her face pale with fear. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words sounded insane coming out of my mouth. A shadow person. Jennifer making inhuman noises. They looked at me like I was losing my mind. "There was something in here," I insisted. Jennifer was sitting at the table, and this thing was watching her. Then it ran out the window. Kathy walked over to the window I'd pointed at. "It's locked from the inside," she said quietly. "And there's no way anyone could fit through this anyway. It's too small." I knew what I saw, but with both of them staring at me doubtfully and Jennifer still unresponsive, I started questioning myself. Had I been sleepwalking, having some kind of waking nightmare? Eventually, we managed to half-drag, half-carry Jennifer back to her bed. We decided to all sleep in the master bedroom together, pushing the 2 armchairs next to the bed to create makeshift beds. Nobody wanted to be alone after that. I didn't sleep at all. Leah and Kathy drifted off eventually, but I kept watch, jumping at every creak and groan of the old camper. Around 6 a.m., Jennifer suddenly sat up, looking completely normal. "Why are you all in my room?" she asked, confused. We stared at her in disbelief. I started to explain what had happened, but she had no memory of getting up, sitting at the table, or anything else. According to her, she'd gone to bed and slept straight through until that moment. The strangest part was the cupcakes. When we went into the kitchen that morning, they were all gone, not a crumb left. We accused each other of eating them, but everyone denied it. The plates they'd been on were neatly stacked in the sink, completely clean. We cut our trip short, making up an excuse about Jennifer feeling sick when Leah's dad came to pick us up the next day. None of us wanted to stay another night. We didn't talk about what happened during the drive home, and Jennifer seemed completely fine, laughing and joking like nothing had occurred. Here's where it gets even weirder. The four of us are still friends. We actually share an apartment now in college. Jennifer is my roommate. She's normal, fun, smart, everything you'd want in a friend. But sometimes I catch her staring out windows at night, especially when it's a new moon. And sometimes, very rarely, I hear that same humming, clicking sound coming from her room after she's fallen asleep. We've never found an explanation for what happened that night. I've researched similar experiences online, but nothing quite matches what we saw. Leah and Kathy have admitted they heard the inhuman scream too, but they're convinced the rest was my imagination or a half-dream. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it was interested in Jennifer. Not hostile exactly, but curious, like it was studying her or communicating with her. I've never told Jennifer about the noises she makes in her sleep. I'm too afraid she'll remember what happened that night. Too afraid that whatever visited us at Piney Creek will realize we're talking about it and come back to finish whatever it started. So I keep watching and waiting and wondering what would have happened if that thing in the corner hadn't been startled away. I still don't know what it was. I've tried convincing myself it was just a big dog, maybe something like a Newfoundland mix that got loose. But dogs don't just appear. They don't watch you like that, and they definitely don't make you feel like prey. This all happened last summer. My girlfriend Jen and I used to go to this park on the edge of town almost every weekend. Riverside Park, it's called, though the actual river is more like a sad little creek that runs along the west side. The park itself is pretty big, about 30 acres, with a playground area near the entrance, some baseball fields in the center, and then this more wild, overgrown section in the back that borders a small forest. We liked going there in the evenings because it was usually empty by then. Sometimes we'd bring a blanket and just chill on the grass. Sometimes we'd smoke a little weed. I know, not exactly legal, but the park was basically deserted after 7 p.m. It was our thing, you know, our little escape from roommates and work stress. The first time we saw it was back in early June. We were sitting on one of the wooden benches near the back baseball field. It was almost sunset, that golden hour where everything looks kind of hazy and beautiful. We'd smoked a little, nothing crazy, just enough to feel relaxed. I remember I was showing Jen something on my phone when she suddenly grabbed my arm. "Matt," she whispered, "what is that?" I looked up and saw something standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards away. At first, I thought it was just a big black dog, like really big. Bigger than any dog I'd ever seen before. It was just standing there, completely still, watching us. "It's just someone's dog," I said, but even as the words came out, something felt off. For one thing, there was nobody else around, no owner calling for it, no leash dragging behind it, and it was so perfectly still. "I don't think so," Jen said. "Look at its eyes." I couldn't really make out its eyes from that distance, but there was something about the way it was positioned, facing us directly, head slightly lowered, that made my skin crawl. We watched it for maybe 30 seconds, and it didn't move at all. Not a tail wag, not a head turn, nothing. "Let's go," I said, suddenly not wanting to be there anymore. As we stood up and started walking toward the parking lot, I kept glancing back. The thing started to move, keeping pace with us but staying at the same distance. It wasn't running or even trotting like a normal dog would. It was just keeping up somehow, staying in the shadows of the trees. We made it to the car without incident, but I remember how quiet it was. Usually there are crickets, distant traffic sounds, something. But that evening, it felt like the whole park was holding its breath. "That was weird," Jen said as we drove away. "Did you see how big that thing was?" I nodded, but I was already trying to rationalize it. We were a little high. It was getting dark. Probably just someone's Great Dane or something that got away. But deep down, I knew it wasn't right. We didn't talk about it much after that night. I think we both wanted to brush it off as nothing. We went back to the park the following weekend, but we stayed closer to the entrance, near the playground area. Everything was normal. The second time was about 2 weeks later. We were completely sober this time. We'd just grabbed some ice cream and decided to eat it at the park before heading home. It was still light out, maybe 7:30 p.m. We were walking along this paved path that loops around the baseball fields when Jen stopped mid-sentence. "It's back," she said quietly. I followed her gaze and felt my heart drop. There it was again, standing by the equipment shed near the furthest baseball diamond. In the daylight, I could see it more clearly. It was massive, easily coming up to my waist if I stood next to it. Its fur was the deepest black I've ever seen, not dark brown or gray-black like most black dogs, but the kind of black that seems to absorb light. And its shape was wrong somehow. Its head was too round, with these strange bear-like ears that didn't fit a dog's profile. But what really got me were its eyes. They were a yellowish amber color, and they were fixed directly on us. "How did it get there?" I asked, confused. "It wasn't there a minute ago." The shed was in an open area with no trees or bushes nearby. There was nowhere it could have been hiding. It had just appeared. "I don't know, but I don't like it," Jen said. "Let's go back to the car." We turned around and started walking quickly back toward the parking lot. I kept looking over my shoulder, and every time I did, the thing had moved closer, but I never actually saw it moving. It was like those weeping angels from Doctor Who. Whenever I wasn't looking directly at it, it would somehow advance. By the time we reached the parking lot, I was practically jogging, pulling Jen along by the hand. When I looked back one last time, the thing was standing at the edge of the lot, maybe 30 feet away. And I swear, Matt, I swear to God, it had no shadow. The early evening sun was casting long shadows from the trees, the benches, even us, but this thing cast nothing on the ground beneath it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those yellow eyes in my mind. I tried looking up large black dog breeds online, but nothing matched what we'd seen. The closest was maybe a black Russian terrier, but even those didn't have the same body shape or ear structure. We didn't go back to the park for almost a month after that. But one evening in late July, Jen suggested we try again. "It was probably just some weird stray," she said. "Lightning doesn't strike 3 times, right?" I was hesitant, but I missed our park evenings. So we went, but I made sure we stayed in the main area near the entrance, where there were still a few families with kids playing. Everything was fine for about an hour. We played a little frisbee, sat on the swings, normal stuff. As it started getting dark, the families began to leave. Soon, we were the only ones there. "See? Everything's fine," Jen said, squeezing my hand. I started to relax. Maybe we had just been freaking ourselves out. Maybe it really was just someone's dog that had gotten loose those other times. We decided to walk just a little way down the main path, not going all the way to the back of the park, but just enjoying the evening. The path curves around a small hill with some picnic tables, and as we rounded that curve, I felt Jen's hand tighten on mine. There it was, standing directly on the path about 30 yards ahead of us, blocking our way. In that moment, I noticed more details that I'd missed before. It was big, yes, but its proportions were all wrong. Its legs were too long and oddly jointed, its head too round, almost like a bear's, but not quite. And those eyes, they weren't just yellow, they seemed to have a faint glow of their own in the dimming light. But the worst part was how it just stood there, perfectly still, watching us. No panting, no ear twitches, nothing that would indicate it was a living, breathing animal. It felt like looking at a photograph of a dog rather than an actual dog. "Turn around," I whispered to Jen, slowly. We began backing away, not taking our eyes off it. Then Jen tugged my sleeve and pointed behind us. My blood turned to ice. There was another one. Same size, same impossible blackness, same yellow eyes, standing about 20 yards behind us on the path. "That's not possible," I heard myself say. "There can't be two of them." But there they were, one in front, one behind, both completely still, except for those eyes that tracked our every movement. "The playground," Jen hissed. "We can cut through and run to the car." The playground was to our right, through a grassy area. We'd have to leave the path, but it was our only option. We started moving sideways, step by step, watching both creatures. And that's when the one behind us finally moved. It wasn't a normal animal movement, not a trot or a run. It was almost like it glided forward, its paws not quite touching the ground. The one in front started moving too, both closing in on us. We ran, sprinted across the grass toward the playground, hearing nothing behind us. No barking, no growling, not even the sound of paws on the ground. I risked a glance back and saw both of them pursuing us, moving with this weird, fluid grace that no dog should have. We reached the playground and scrambled through it, ducking under the slide and weaving between the swing sets. I looked back again and saw only one of them now, standing at the edge of the playground. The other was gone. "Where's the other one?" I gasped. Jen screamed and pointed. The second one was somehow ahead of us now, standing by the water fountain near the path to the parking lot. It had moved impossibly fast, cutting us off. We changed direction, heading toward the fence that separated the park from the neighboring street. The fence was only about 5 feet high. We could climb it. We reached it, and I boosted Jen up. As she scrambled over, I looked back one more time. Both creatures were now moving directly toward us, no longer trying to circle or cut us off. They were coming straight for us, and they were moving fast. I climbed the fence in what felt like a single motion, fueled by pure adrenaline. We dropped down on the other side and ran to my car, which was parked on the street. As I fumbled with my keys, I looked back at the fence. They were both standing there, watching us from the other side. They made no attempt to climb or jump the fence. They just watched. We got in the car and I peeled out, driving way too fast through the residential streets. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. "What the fuck was that?" Jen finally said. "I don't know," I replied, my hand still shaking on the steering wheel. But they weren't dogs. After that night, we agreed to find a new place to hang out. But the experience stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about those things, how they moved, how they appeared and disappeared, how they seemed to be hurting us, trapping us. About 2 weeks later, I did something stupid. I went back alone. In broad daylight, on a Saturday when I knew the park would be busy, I told myself I just wanted to confirm it was nothing. Maybe spot a normal black dog that could explain what we'd seen. The park was full of people, families having picnics, kids playing baseball, teenagers hanging out, everything completely normal. I walked the entire park, even going to the back area near the forest. Nothing unusual. I started to feel silly for being so scared. Maybe we really had just seen some stray dogs, and our imaginations turned them into something more sinister. As I was heading back to my car, feeling relieved, I passed an older man who was walking his golden retriever. The dog was pulling at its leash, whining and trying to go in the opposite direction. "Easy, girl," the man was saying. "What's gotten into you today?" I don't know what made me stop and ask, but I did. "Your dog seems upset. Is she usually like that here?" The man shook his head. "No, she loves this park. But lately she's been acting strange about coming to this side." He gestured toward the back area I'd just come from. "Started about a month ago. Now she throws a fit if I try to walk her back there." "Has she seen anything that scared her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Not that I noticed," he said. "But animals sense things we don't, you know. My wife says there might be coyotes or something in those woods." I nodded and wished him a good day, then continued to my car. Coyotes. That had to be it. Just some coyotes that had wandered into the park. But deep down, I knew better. Coyotes don't have yellow eyes that follow you. They don't appear out of nowhere. And they definitely don't move the way those things moved. I managed to convince myself to go one more time. This time with Jen, but during the busiest time of day, Sunday afternoon. We stayed in the main area near other people, and everything was fine. We even laughed about how scared we'd been. "Must have been some weird strays," Jen said, echoing my thoughts about coyotes. "Yeah," I agreed. "Still weird, though." We were feeling brave enough that we decided to walk a little further into the park, still staying on the main paths where other people were around. We reached the small hill with the picnic tables, the same spot where we'd seen them last time. There were families having lunch at most of the tables. Kids were running around playing tag. Everything was normal. We found an empty table and sat down with the sodas we'd brought. It was a beautiful day, warm but not too hot, with a light breeze. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely relaxed at the park. "I'm glad we came back," Jen said, smiling at me. "I missed this place." I was about to agree when I noticed something odd. The family at the table closest to the wooded area was packing up hurriedly, even though they had just sat down with their food not 10 minutes earlier. The father was grabbing their cooler while the mother was quickly collecting their children who had been playing nearby. As they rushed past our table, I overheard the little boy asking, "But why do we have to go, Mommy? We just got here." "I told you," she replied in a tense voice. "It's going to rain soon." I looked up at the sky. It was completely clear, not a cloud in sight. That's when I felt it. A stillness in the air. The birds had stopped singing. The distant sounds of children playing seemed to fade. And there was this weight, this pressure, like the air itself had gotten denser. I looked at Jen and could tell she felt it too. Her eyes were wide, scanning the surrounding area. "Let's go," I said quietly. We stood up, leaving our drinks on the table, and started walking quickly toward the parking lot. I noticed other families were leaving too, parents hurrying their children along with worried glances over their shoulders. Something was wrong. Everyone could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. We had just reached the path that led to the parking lot when Jen grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Don't look now," she whispered, "but it's by the tree line, the big oak." I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to just keep walking, to get to the car as fast as possible, but I couldn't help it. I had to see. I turned my head slightly, glancing toward the large oak tree that stood at the edge of the wooded area about 50 yards away. It was there, just standing, watching, in broad daylight, with dozens of people still in the park. But here's the thing. No one else seemed to notice it. People were walking right past, some even quite close to it, without giving it a second glance. It was as if it was invisible to everyone but us. "How is no one else seeing that?" I hissed. "I don't know," Jen replied, her voice shaking. "But please, let's just go." We quickened our pace, almost jogging now. I kept looking back, and each time the thing had moved closer, always staying just at the edge of my peripheral vision. We reached the parking lot and rushed to my car. As I was unlocking it, I looked back one last time. The thing was standing at the entrance to the lot, its yellow eyes fixed on us. And for the first time, I saw its mouth open, revealing rows of teeth that were too numerous, too sharp for any normal dog. We drove away, and I didn't slow down until we were several miles from the park. "It followed us," Jen said, her voice small. "In the middle of the day, with all those people around." "And no one else saw it," I added. "How is that possible?" "I don't know, but I'm never going back there," she declared. "Never." I agreed. Whatever those things were, they seemed fixated on us for some reason, and I didn't want to find out why. But I broke that promise. One last time. I had to know. 3 days later, while Jen was at work, I went back to the park. I don't know what I was thinking. Curiosity? A need to prove to myself that I wasn't going crazy? Whatever it was stupid. I parked my car, but didn't get out right away. The park seemed quieter than it should have been for a weekday afternoon. There were a few people walking dogs on the main paths, a couple of kids on the playground, but not as many as usual. I finally got out and walked toward the back of the park, toward the wooded area where we always saw the creatures. Every step felt heavier than the last. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached the edge of the woods and stood there, looking in. Nothing but trees and undergrowth, no sign of anything unusual. "What are you?" I said out loud, not really expecting an answer. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer. Nothing happened. No creatures appeared, no strange feelings, just an ordinary stretch of woods on an ordinary day. I was about to turn back, feeling both relieved and foolish, when I noticed something on the ground near my feet. At first, I thought it was just an oddly shaped shadow, but when I looked closer, I realized it was a paw print, a massive paw print, bigger than my hand, pressed deep into the soft earth. I crouched down to examine it. It didn't look like any dog or coyote print I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong, more rounded, with no distinct toe pads, almost like a bear's print, but not quite. As I was studying it, I became aware of a presence behind me. I felt it before I heard or saw anything. A shift in the air, a weight pressing down, making it hard to breathe. I stood up slowly and turned around. It was there, right there, not 10 feet away, standing perfectly still, those yellow eyes fixed on me. But it wasn't alone. Behind it, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, were more of them. 3, maybe 4 more, all identical. The same impossible blackness, the same yellow eyes, all watching me with that same unnatural stillness. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think. All I could do was stare back as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. The one in front, the one we'd seen before, took a step toward me. It was the first time I'd actually seen one of them move while I was looking directly at it. The movement was fluid but wrong somehow, like watching something underwater. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not looking back, not stopping for anything. I could feel them behind me, though I heard nothing. No footsteps, no breathing, no sounds at all. I reached the parking lot and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them. As I bent to pick them up, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creatures were lined up at the edge of the lot, all 5 of them watching me. They made no move to come closer, but they didn't need to. The message was clear. This is our place. You don't belong here. I got in my car and drove away, and I haven't been back since. Jen and I don't talk about it anymore. We found a new park on the other side of town, and we never go out after dark. But sometimes, when I'm driving home late, and my route takes me past Riverside Park, I slow down and look out the window. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of something black standing under the streetlight at the park entrance. Something with round ears and yellow eyes that follow my car until I'm out of sight. I still don't know what they were. Part of me hopes I never find out. I've never shared this story with anyone outside my family before. It happened last summer on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and I still get chills thinking about it. I've always been a night owl, no pun intended, you'll understand why later, and I loved taking walks after everyone else had gone to bed. There's something special about the reservation at night. The silence is different from anywhere else. It's like the land itself is breathing. I'd wander through the trees, cedar, oak, elm, and cottonwood, listening to the night sounds and feeling connected to everything around me. Sometimes I'd be out until midnight, just walking and thinking. My parents never really minded. Mom would usually be asleep by the time I got back, and Dad would sometimes still be up watching TV. It was our normal routine until that night. I remember it was particularly clear, stars everywhere, barely any wind. I'd gone a bit further than usual, following a path that wound through a stand of cottonwoods near the creek bed. When I finally walked up our driveway around 11:30, I immediately noticed something was off. Dad was sitting on the porch steps, completely still, just staring out into the darkness. The dogs in the area were going crazy, barking non-stop like they all sensed something. "Dad, everything okay?" I asked, walking up. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, he said, "Nathan, come inside. It's late." That was it. No lecture about staying out too late. No questions about where I'd been. Just this strange tension I couldn't understand. I didn't push it. Something in his voice told me not to. The next day, everything seemed normal again. I helped with chores, hung out with some friends, and by evening, I was getting ready for another night walk. I had my shoes on and was heading for the door when Dad called me from the kitchen. "Nathan, hold up. Come sit down for a minute." I found him at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee even though it was already past 8. He motioned for me to sit across from him. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low and serious. "Something that happened to me when I was about your age." Now, my dad isn't exactly the storytelling type. He's pretty quiet, keeps to himself most of the time. So when he starts voluntarily sharing something from his past, especially with that look on his face, you pay attention. "When I was a teenager," he began, "maybe 16 or 17, I used to ride my horse to visit friends, stay out late, like you do with your walks. My parents didn't mind much. Different times back then." He paused, took a sip of his coffee. "One night it was a full moon, bright as day almost. I was riding back home, must have been around midnight. I remember feeling good, young, free, you know. My horse was following the path we always took, through the trees and along the creek bed. Dad shifted in his chair, and I noticed his knuckles were white around the mug. About halfway home, my horse stopped dead, wouldn't move. His ears were pricked forward, and he was staring down into the dry creek bed. I followed his gaze and saw something white moving among the trees down below. At first I thought maybe it was someone walking, wearing something light-colored that caught the moonlight. He took another sip of coffee, and I realized I was leaning forward, completely caught up in his story. Then this thing jumped out from the trees. It was an owl, a white owl. But Nathan, this wasn't just any owl. This thing was massive. Wingspan looked as long as my horse. I'd never seen anything like it. I must have looked skeptical because Dad shook his head firmly. I know what I saw. This wasn't a regular barn owl or anything natural. It came right for us, flying straight at my horse and me. My horse reared up, nearly threw me off. Then the owl flew right over us, so close I could feel the air from its wings. It just disappeared, heading up toward the moon. Dad paused again, his eyes focused somewhere past me, like he was seeing it all happen again. I got my horse under control and kept heading home. We lived in the old place then, the one with the creek wrapping around two sides, pine-covered hills on another, and that big alfalfa field out front. I was almost home, passing by the field where we kept the hay stacked, when my horse spooked again. Worse this time. He was trembling, eyes rolling, refusing to move forward. I looked toward where he was staring, out at the haystacks. And that's when I saw it. Something was lying on top of one of the haystacks. In the moonlight, I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but it wasn't supposed to be there. My horse bolted then, took off at a full gallop toward home. I couldn't stop him, just had to hang on. When we got to the house, I practically fell off him. My mom was still up, and she came outside when she heard me ride in so fast. I told her what happened, what I'd seen. Dad's voice had dropped even lower now, and I had to strain to hear him. That's when the dogs started barking. Not just our dogs. Every dog for what seemed like miles around. My father, your grandfather, he grabbed his rifle and went outside. I followed him to the porch, but he told me to stay put. He walked out toward the haystacks, rifle ready. I could see him in the moonlight, moving cautiously. When he got close to the haystacks, he stopped. I heard him call out, asking who was there. Then I saw him raise his rifle, pointing it at the top of one of the stacks. Dad took a deep breath. Grandpa told me later that he saw what looked like someone peeking over the top of the haystack. He said he saw movement, like whatever it was slid down the back side. He ran around to the other side, and that's when he saw it clearly. He said it was about 7 feet tall, covered in hair that glistened in the moonlight, standing on 2 legs, but not human. Not an animal he recognized either. Grandpa was a hunter all his life, knew every creature in these parts. This was something else. He could have shot it, had a clear shot, but something held him back. He said he just watched as this thing slowly walked away from him across the field. Then, suddenly, it was moving fast, faster than anything should be able to move. And it was gone. Dad finished his coffee in one long swallow, then set the mug down hard on the table. I'm telling you this, Nathan, because last night, when you were out walking, all the dogs started barking at once. Just like that night. And I saw a white owl perched in the tree right outside our house. Biggest damn owl I've ever seen. I felt a chill run down my spine. Dad, what are you saying? The owl isn't just an owl, Nathan. In our traditions, it's a messenger. That night when I was your age, the white owl appeared right before I encountered danger. It wasn't a coincidence. He leaned across the table, his eyes locked on mine. I need you to stay inside after dark for a while. When the dogs bark like that, when an owl that size appears, it means something's out there, something that shouldn't be. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was being superstitious, but the look on his face stopped me. This wasn't my dad being overprotective. He was genuinely afraid. Okay, I said, I'll stay in. He nodded, seeming relieved. Good, that's good. The next morning at breakfast, Dad mentioned casually that he'd seen another white owl during the night, outside my window this time. He said it like he was commenting on the weather, but I caught the look he exchanged with Mom. For the next few weeks I stayed inside after dark. It was hard. I missed my night walks, but I respected Dad's warning. The dogs still barked some nights, all at once, like they were seeing the same thing. I'd lie in bed listening, wondering what was out there. Then my aunt got sick. It happened suddenly. She was fine one day, in the hospital the next. A week later she was gone. At the funeral, Dad squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "The owl is a messenger, son. It warns us of what's coming." That was 3 months ago. I've started taking walks again recently, but never after dark. Sometimes I think I see something white moving through the trees in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. Last week, I was helping Dad stack hay in the field. As we worked, I finally got up the courage to ask him more about what Grandpa had seen that night. "Dad, that thing Grandpa saw by the haystacks, what do you think it was?" He stopped working, leaned on his pitchfork, and looked out across the field toward the tree line. "Some things don't have names," he said finally, "or they have old names that people don't use anymore. But they've always been here, long before us." "But what was it doing here?" I pressed. "Why did it come near your house?" Dad was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "The old ones say there are guardians that walk the boundaries between worlds. They appear when those boundaries thin, when things from one side might cross to the other." He turned to me then, his expression dead serious. "The owl warns us. It doesn't cause the danger. It tells us it's coming. That's why I knew something was wrong the night you were out walking. That's why I knew about your aunt before anyone else did." I think about that conversation a lot now, about what might be out in those trees after dark, about what the owls are trying to tell us. 2 nights ago, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of dogs barking, that same frantic, unified barking from before. I went to my window and looked out. The moon was full and bright, lighting up our yard and the field beyond, and there, perched on a fence post directly in my line of sight, was a white owl. It was massive, just like Dad described. Its head swiveled, and for a moment its eyes met mine. I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move or call out. Then it spread its wings, and God, they were enormous, stretching wider than seemed possible, and launched itself into the air. It flew straight toward my window, and I stumbled backward, certain it would crash through the glass. But at the last moment, it veered upward, disappearing into the night sky. I haven't told Dad about this yet. I'm not sure I want to know what message the owl was bringing this time. But I keep watching the trees at dusk, and I don't walk alone anymore, day or night. Something's out there in the reservation, something that's been there a long time. And sometimes, when the conditions are just right, when the boundary between worlds thins, it comes close enough for us to see. The owls know. They've always known. And now I understand why my ancestors took their warnings so seriously. Some messengers you don't ignore. I've never written about this before. My hands are actually shaking as I type this. I grew up in a small town in central Idaho, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and most families have lived there for generations. We were what you'd call mountain folk, not rich by any means, but we had what we needed. During my high school years, it was a family tradition that me, Mason, my 2 younger brothers Luke and Ethan, would help my dad collect firewood after school during the fall months. Idaho winters are brutal, and we needed enough wood to keep our house warm, plus extra for my grandmother's cabin down the road, and a few elderly neighbors who couldn't collect their own. Our routine was pretty straightforward. Dad would drive us up into the mountains in our old Ford F-150 after school, usually around 3:30 p.m. We'd spend a few hours felling dead trees, never live ones. Dad was strict about that. And Dad would saw them into manageable chunks while we'd roll them to the truck and load them up. We'd typically head home before dark, unload the next day, and repeat the process until we had enough for winter. Last October, God, it's been almost a year now, we decided to try a different spot. Our usual logging roads were getting picked clean by other locals, and Dad had heard about some good deadfall on the other side of the valley. I remember it was a Wednesday because I was bitching about missing basketball practice. The sky was overcast, and there was that distinct chill in the air that signals winter is coming in Idaho. The road Dad chose wasn't on any of our usual routes. It was a Forest Service road that hadn't been maintained in years. The first mile or so was fine, but then it got rough, like really rough. Dad had to stop the truck several times so Luke, Ethan, and I could move fallen branches and bigger rocks out of the way. It was slow going, and I remember checking my watch, worried we wouldn't have much daylight left to actually gather wood. As we climbed higher up the mountain, I started feeling off. I can't really explain it better than that. At first I thought maybe it was just the altitude or that I was hungry, but it was different. It felt like the mountain knew we were there, and it didn't want us there. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. I didn't say anything at first because I didn't want to sound like a weirdo, but then Luke, who was 15 at the time, turned to me and whispered, "This place feels weird, doesn't it?" That's when I knew it wasn't just me. Dad finally stopped the truck in a small clearing about 7 miles up. The trees were dense around us, mostly pines and some aspens that had already dropped their leaves. The ground was covered in pine needles, and there was an unusual silence. Usually in the woods, you hear birds, small animals rustling around, the wind in the trees. But here, nothing. Just the sound of our boots crunching on pine needles. "All right, boys," Dad said. "Let's get to work. Looks like plenty of deadfall in this area." Dad grabbed his chainsaw from the truck bed while we put on our work gloves. Normally we'd spread out a bit to find good pieces, but that day none of us ventured far from each other. I kept finding myself looking over my shoulder, like someone was watching me. Luke was doing the same thing, and even Ethan, who was only 13 and usually fearless, stayed unusually close to Dad. We worked for about an hour, and the truck was maybe half full when I noticed Dad kept glancing up at the ridgeline above us. He was distracted, which wasn't like him at all. Dad was always focused on the task at hand. I was dragging a decent-sized log back to the truck when I caught him staring into the trees again. "Dad, you okay?" I asked. He snapped out of it and looked at me, then at the truck. "Yeah, I'm fine. You know what? I think we've got enough for today." That was weird. The truck wasn't even close to being full, and we'd driven all the way out here. But before I could question him, he called to my brothers, "Luke, Ethan, pack it up. We're heading out." Luke looked relieved, but Ethan asked, "Already? We've barely got anything." "We'll come back another day," Dad said, but there was something in his tone that told me we wouldn't. "Let's load up." We secured the wood we'd gathered and piled into the truck. Dad started the engine, and I remember the relief I felt when it turned over on the first try. As we began making our way back down the mountain, following the same rough dirt road with its sharp switchbacks, I noticed Dad kept checking the rear-view mirror. We'd gone maybe 2 miles when something brown blurred in front of the truck. Dad slammed on the brakes, and we skidded a few feet before coming to a stop. There was a sickening thud as we hit whatever had jumped in front of us. "Shit," Dad muttered. "Probably a deer." He grabbed his rifle from behind the seat. Standard procedure in Idaho: if you hit a deer, you don't leave an animal suffering, and we all got out to check. What we found wasn't what any of us expected. It was a deer, all right, but it hadn't jumped in front of us. This deer was already dead, and had been for some time. Its body was bloated, and when Dad nudged it with his boot, I saw maggots crawling in its flesh. The smell hit me then, that unmistakable stench of rotting meat, and I gagged. "What the hell?" I said. "How did this get in front of the truck?" Dad didn't answer. He was looking up the slope, into the trees. I followed his gaze, but couldn't see anything unusual at first. Then I noticed movement, just a slight shifting of shadows between the trees, about 50 yards up. "Get back in the truck," Dad said quietly, his voice tense in a way I'd never heard before. "Now." We didn't argue. Something in his tone scared me more than anything else that had happened. As I was climbing into the passenger seat, I heard it, a high-pitched shriek that didn't sound like any animal I knew. Then another, answering from farther up the mountain. Then the sound of branches breaking, like something, or several somethings, were coming down the slope toward us. Dad jumped into the driver's seat, jammed the truck into gear, and floored it. We hit the deer carcass again, the truck bouncing violently as we drove over it. Luke and Ethan were in the back seat, both white as sheets. Ethan was crying silently. "Dad, what was that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Don't look back," was all he said, white-knuckling the steering wheel as he navigated the rough road much faster than was safe. Of course, I looked back. Through the rear window, past the stack of firewood in the truck bed, I could see movement in the trees along the road behind us. Not clear shapes, just darting shadows, keeping pace with the truck despite the speed we were going. The shrieking continued, seeming to come from multiple directions now, following us down the mountain. We hit a particularly deep pothole, and the truck fishtailed. Dad fought for control, barely keeping us from sliding off the road and down the steep embankment. A tree branch scraped against my window, making me jump. "Almost there," Dad kept saying, more to himself than to us. "Almost there." The shrieking followed us for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes. It only stopped when we cleared the tree line and entered the open desert sagebrush that marked the valley floor. Dad didn't slow down until we hit the paved highway, and even then, he drove well over the speed limit all the way home. None of us spoke during that drive. When we pulled into our driveway, it was almost dark. Mom came out onto the porch, probably wondering why we were back so early and with so little wood. One look at our faces, and her expression changed from curious to concerned. "What happened?" she asked as we all got out of the truck. Dad just shook his head. "Boys, go inside. I need to talk to your mother." We did as we were told. Through the kitchen window, I could see them talking in the yard. Mom's hand went to her mouth at one point, and she looked up toward the mountains, visible as a dark silhouette against the darkening sky. Later that night, after Luke and Ethan had gone to bed, Dad came to my room. He sat on the edge of my bed, looking tired in a way I'd never seen before. "What I'm about to tell you stays between us," he said. "I don't want to scare your brothers more than they already are." I nodded, my heart pounding. "That deer didn't jump in front of us," he said. "It was thrown." The hairs on my arms stood up. "Thrown? By what?" Dad ran a hand over his face. "I don't know exactly, but I've heard stories from the old-timers. The Native Americans from this region had legends about things that lived in certain mountains, things that didn't like trespassers." Like what? Bigfoot or something?" I asked, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Dad shook his head. No, the legends described them as something worse. He paused. I felt something was off the moment we turned onto that road. Kept seeing, I don't know, shapes ducking behind trees. Thought it was just my imagination at first. But when we stopped for that deer, whatever was in those woods started closing in on us. My mouth went dry. Closing in? You mean they were hunting us? I think they were trying to stop the truck, get us to step away from it. The deer was bait or a warning. I'm not sure. He looked me in the eye. Mason, I've hunted these mountains my whole life. I've never felt anything like what I felt today, like we were being watched by something intelligent that meant us harm. I remembered the shadows I'd seen moving through the trees, keeping pace with our speeding truck. Do you think they would have... I couldn't finish the sentence. I don't know, Dad said honestly, and I don't want to find out. We're not going back to that part of the mountain. In fact, I think we'll buy our firewood this season. And that's exactly what we did. For the rest of that fall and winter, Dad would drive to a commercial lot in the next town over and buy pre-cut firewood. It cost a lot more, but he didn't seem to mind. We never talked about that day as a family. Sometimes I'd catch Luke's eye, and I knew he was thinking about it too, but we never discussed it. Dad made some calls, and I overheard him telling someone about unusual activity on that Forest Service road. A month later, I noticed the road had been closed off with a new gate and no trespassing signs. I graduated high school that spring and left for college in Boise. When I came home for Thanksgiving, I tried to bring it up with Dad, but he shut the conversation down immediately. All he would say was, "Some places aren't meant to be disturbed, son." I've spent a lot of time researching local legends since then, trying to figure out what we encountered that day. The closest I've come is an obscure Native American legend about shadow walkers, or tree people, that were said to guard certain sacred areas in the mountains. They were described as being able to mimic animals or even people to lure unwary travelers away from safety. I don't know what chased us down that mountain last October. I don't know why they threw a dead deer in front of our truck or what they would have done if they'd caught us. But I know what I felt that day. A primal fear unlike anything I've experienced before or since. And sometimes, when I'm home visiting and I look up at that particular mountain ridge, I swear I can feel eyes watching me, even from miles away. The Forest Service road is still closed, Dad still buys his firewood, and none of us have ever gone back to that side of the valley.